The stagecoach hit a rut so hard that Clara Whitmore's teeth clicked together and her elbow slammed into the wooden side panel. She didn't cry out. She'd stopped making noise about the discomfort somewhere around the second day when she'd realized the other passengers, a livestock broker with sour breath and a woman traveling to visit her sister, had no interest in her complaints and even less capacity to do anything about them. So she pressed her lips together and watched Wyoming roll past the smeared window, flat and vast and utterly indifferent to her. 11 days. She had been on this coach, or ones like it, for 11 days. Before that, 3 days on a train from Ohio, sitting upright in a seat that seemed designed by someone who had never had to sit in it for more than an hour. Before that, 2 weeks of packing and selling and saying goodbye to a life that had already been half dismantled by grief. Before that was a different story, one she'd mostly stopped telling herself. She was 31 years old. She had been a school teacher for 9 years in Harlan County, Ohio, which meant she had spent nearly a decade managing other people's children in a room that was too cold in winter and too hot in summer, and she had been decent at it, maybe even good at it on her better days. She had been married for 4 of those years to a man named George Whitmore, who had been kind and funny and had died of a lung sickness in February with very little warning, leaving her a widow with a rented house, a small savings that wouldn't last 2 years, and a particular hollow feeling she hadn't found a name for yet. The advertisement had run in a newspaper she didn't usually read. She'd picked it up at the general store because Mrs. Hadley had left it on the counter, and she'd only skimmed it because she was waiting for her flour order. Cattle rancher, Wyoming Territory, seeks capable woman of good character for marriage and domestic partnership. Widower with 2 children. Serious inquiries only. She'd thought about it for 3 weeks before she wrote the letter. She'd written 4 drafts. The one she sent was the most honest, which was also the most frightening. She'd said plainly that she was not beautiful, that she was not wealthy, that she had no family money or particular connections, but that she knew how to work and she knew how to teach, and she was not given to complaint. She'd almost added I am lonely in a way that's starting to feel permanent, but had crossed that out because it seemed like too much. Cole Mercer had written back within 2 weeks. His letter was short, not rude, just economical. The way a man writes when he has a lot of things demanding his attention and not much time for pretty words. He had said that her letter was the most straightforward he'd received, that he appreciated straightforwardness, and that if she was willing to make the journey, he would cover the travel costs and they could determine from there whether the arrangement suited them both. Not exactly a love letter, but she'd read it 3 times. She'd sold her furniture, paid the last of her rent, said goodbye to a small number of friends who looked at her with expressions she didn't quite know how to interpret. Something between admiration and the kind of pity people feel for someone doing something they themselves would be too afraid to do. And she had gotten on the train. Now she was here. Or almost here. The coach was slowing, and through the dirty window she could see the raw, unfinished edges of a town, a cluster of wood-fronted buildings, a water trough, a few horses tied to a hitching rail. A sign above one building said, Mercer Flats, though whether that was the town's name or just a description of the landscape she couldn't tell. End of the line, the driver called. Clara picked up her carpet bag, which was the only luggage she still had with her. The trunk had been strapped to the back and was presumably still intact, though she'd stopped worrying about it somewhere around day 7. And she climbed down the coach steps onto dirt that was so dry it puffed up around her boots in little clouds. She looked around. There was no one waiting. She stood there for a moment, carpetbag in hand, while the livestock broker pushed past her without a word, and the other woman was immediately embraced by someone who was presumably her sister. The driver handed down the trunk with about as much ceremony as dropping a sack of grain. Clara looked at the trunk, then looked at the street, then looked at the buildings, none of which seemed to be expecting her. She was trying to decide whether she should go into the building that appeared to be a general store and ask someone, and how exactly she would phrase that question without sounding like the situation she was in, when she heard boots on the dirt behind her. She turned. He was taller than she'd imagined, which was irrational because she hadn't known enough to imagine anything specific. Broad through the shoulders in the way of someone who used those shoulders regularly, not for show. Dark hair, some gray at the temples. A face that had been outside in the Wyoming sun long enough to put lines around the eyes and at the corners of his mouth. He was wearing a plain work shirt and carrying his hat in one hand, and he was looking at her with an expression that was frankly difficult to read. She became acutely aware that she had dust in her hair, that her dress had torn at the hem somewhere around day 4, and she'd pinned it rather than repaired it because there wasn't room in the coach to do otherwise. That she probably looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had been traveling for 11 days on not enough sleep and had arrived at the end of it looking considerably worse than she had started. "Miss Whitmore," he said. Not a question. "Yes." She straightened her back. "Mr. Mercer." He looked at her for a moment, not the way men sometimes looked at women, appraising and calculating, but something more like the way you'd look at a road you were trying to judge the condition of. Assessing. She had the uncomfortable feeling that whatever he was assessing, he was drawing conclusions faster than she'd like. Then he nodded, once, and put his hat back on. "Let me get your trunk." I've got it." He picked up the trunk with the easy manner of someone for whom lifting heavy things was simply part of the ongoing business of being alive, and he started toward a wagon she now noticed was parked a little way down the street. She followed him, carpetbag in hand, not entirely sure what else to do. "Good journey?" he asked, without looking back. "Long," she said. "Yeah." He loaded the trunk into the wagon bed. "They usually are." He helped her up to the wagon seat. His hand was rough, calloused, and brief, not lingering, and then went around to the other side and climbed up. He took the reins. He didn't say anything else for a moment. Clara looked at the town as they began to move through it, such as it was. A blacksmith's, a dry goods store, a small building that might have been a post office. Not much. Not nothing either, but not much. "How far is the ranch?" she asked. "About 40 minutes. Do you—" She stopped because she wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. "Do you have questions for me? Do you want to talk? Do you have any idea what I'm doing here?" None of those were quite right. "The children," she said instead. "How old are they?" Something shifted in his jaw, just slightly. "Maggie's 5. Ethan's 12. And their mother—" She stopped herself. "I'm sorry, you don't have to—" "She died 3 years ago," he said. Flat and factual, the way you say something when you've had to say it enough times that the words have worn smooth. "Fever." "I'm sorry." He didn't say anything to that. The town gave way to open land, and the open land in Wyoming was something that Clara had read about and not quite believed until she was sitting in the middle of it. The sky was enormous. She had grown up in Ohio, where the land was cut into neat fields and the horizon was usually interrupted by a tree line or a barn or something. And here there was just space, wide and spare and going on farther than seemed reasonable. It was beautiful, she thought, in a way that was a little alarming, like something that could swallow you whole. "You taught school," Cole said. Not quite a question. 9 years. In Ohio. Harlan County, yes. He was quiet for a moment. "Can you cook?" She almost laughed. Not unkindly, just at the directness of it. "Yes, I'm not fancy about it, but I can cook." "I don't need fancy." He looked straight ahead at the trail. Mrs. Aldridge, she was helping with the house and the children after Eleanor died. She left in March. Her sister needed her in Colorado. "We've been managing, but—" He stopped. "It's been hard on the children, Maggie especially." Clara nodded. She could imagine it, or thought she could. A 5-year-old without a mother for 3 years being managed by a father who clearly had approximately 40 other demands on him at any given moment. "You were married," he said. 4 years. He died in February. Lung sickness. "I'm sorry." "Thank you." A pause. "So you understand perhaps why the arrangement seemed practical," he said. "Yes, practical." She looked out at the land. "I wasn't sure you'd—" She stopped again. "What?" "I wasn't sure what to expect," she said, which was honest but also not quite what she'd almost said. What she'd almost said was, "I wasn't sure you'd want me when you actually saw me." But that seemed like the kind of thing you didn't say out loud. Not yet, anyway. Maybe not ever. Cole glanced at her, just briefly. "Your letter was honest," he said. That counted for something. It wasn't a compliment exactly, but she found herself holding on to it anyway. The ranch appeared over a low rise of land about 40 minutes later, just as he'd said. Clara saw it first as a collection of shapes, a main house, a large barn, some smaller outbuildings. And then as they came closer, she saw the details. A fence that needed repair on the north side, a kitchen garden that had probably been started with good intentions and was now somewhat past its best, a porch that had a loose board she could identify by the slight warp in the wood from 100 feet away. It was real. It was genuinely, irreversibly real. And she was here, and this was going to be her life. The thought arrived without fanfare or panic, just as a plain fact. She let it settle. Cole had barely brought the wagon to a stop in the yard before the front door of the house burst open and a small figure came running out at a speed that seemed genuinely dangerous given the unevenness of the ground. Clara had just enough time to register small, dark-haired pigtails coming loose, and then the girl pulled up short about 6 feet away and stared up at her with enormous brown eyes. "You're here," the girl said. "I am," Clara said. "I'm Maggie." "I know. Your father told me about you." She looked at the child, this small, serious-faced little person studying her with an intensity that was almost professional. "I'm Clara." Maggie considered this. Then she said, with the particular bluntness of a 5-year-old who has not yet learned that some questions make adults uncomfortable, "Are you pretty?" There was a short, startled silence. "Maggie," Cole said from the other side of the wagon. "What? I just asked." Maggie didn't look away from Clara. "My friend Alice said Papa was getting a pretty lady to come live here, but you look—" She tilted her head, assessing. "You look tired." "I am tired," Clara said. "I've been traveling for 11 days. I expect pretty is hard to manage at the end of 11 days. Maggie seemed to find this reasonable. She nodded as if filing it away for future reference. Then her face shifted, something softer and more uncertain coming through the matter-of-fact exterior, and she asked, very quietly, "Can you be my mama?" The question landed in the air between them and didn't dissipate. Clara felt it settle against her chest like a hand pressed there. She heard Cole go very still on the other side of the wagon. She didn't look at him. She looked at Maggie. This small child who had lost her mother at 2 years old, who probably had almost no real memory of her, who was standing in the Wyoming dirt with her pigtails half unraveled, asking a stranger for the most fundamental thing a child can ask for. Clara's throat felt tight. She swallowed. "I don't know yet," she said honestly, "but I would like to try." Maggie looked at her for a long moment. Then something in her small face seemed to settle, not convinced exactly, but willing to wait and see. And she turned around and ran back toward the house, pigtails streaming. Clara climbed down from the wagon. Her legs were stiff from sitting and the ground felt strange under her feet, too solid after so long in motion. She stood there a moment, getting her balance. Cole came around the side of the wagon. He was looking at her with that same difficult expression, not unkind, but careful. He started. "She's wonderful," Clara said, and meant it. He looked at her a moment longer. Then he picked up her carpet bag and headed toward the house. "I'll show you where you'll sleep." The house was bigger inside than it had looked from the road, though not large by any generous measurement. A main room that served as sitting room and dining room both, a kitchen that had clearly once been organized and had gotten steadily less so over time, 2 bedrooms, one clearly Cole's, one where the children slept, and a small room off the back that had probably been a storage room at some point and was now barely large enough for a narrow bed and a chest of drawers. "It's not much," Cole said. "It's fine," she said. She meant that too, though she was also cataloging. The shelves that had been put up crooked, the curtain rod with one end pulling loose from the wall, the window above the dry sink that probably let in cold air. Not criticism, just information. Things she could fix. "Ethan's not here," Cole said. "He went out with the hands today. He'll be back before supper." She nodded. "There's water in the pump outside. I'll start supper if you want to." He stopped. "I don't know what you want to do." "Rest, probably." "I'll manage supper," she said, "if you tell me what you have." He gave her a look that was, she thought, somewhere between surprised and something she couldn't read yet. "You just got off a coach after 11 days, and supper still needs to happen." She set down her carpet bag and looked at the kitchen. "Where do you keep the flour?" She made a simple thing. Biscuits, because the flour was good, and she knew how, and a stew from what she found in the larder. Nothing fancy, Just whatever vegetables were available and a piece of salt pork. The kitchen took some getting used to. The stove ran hot on one side, and she didn't know that at first and nearly burned the first batch of biscuits before she adjusted. But she caught it in time. Maggie sat at the kitchen table the whole time, watching her with those serious brown eyes, occasionally offering information that Clara suspected was more designed to help her own evaluation than to help Clara cook. "Papa burns things sometimes," Maggie reported. "I'll try not to." Mrs. Aldridge made soup. A pause. "It wasn't very good." Noted. "I like biscuits." "Good, because I'm making them." Maggie seemed pleased by this. She swung her feet under the table, too high off the ground for them to reach, and asked, "Where did you come from?" "Ohio." "Where's that?" "Very far east, past the Mississippi River." "I've never seen a river," Maggie said, in a tone that managed to be both factual and deeply mournful. "There are rivers in Wyoming. Papa says they're more like creeks." Clara pressed the biscuits into shape and set them in the pan. "Well, maybe someday you'll see a real river." Maggie considered this with the seriousness it apparently deserved. "Did you have children?" she asked. Clara's hands paused, just for a second. "No," she said. "I didn't." "Why not?" "Maggie." Cole's voice came from the doorway of the kitchen. He was leaning against the frame with his arms crossed. He must have come in quietly, or she'd been too focused on the stove to hear him. "That's not a polite question." Maggie made a face. "I just asked. You can ask things without asking everything all at once." Maggie looked unimpressed by this distinction, but subsided. Clara glanced at Cole over her shoulder. He met her eyes for a moment, something that might have been an apology in his expression, and then he looked away. "I'll get some more wood," he said, and went back out. "Patek." Ethan came in at sundown. Clara heard him before she saw him. Heavy boots on the porch, the door opening with a particular kind of deliberateness, the sound of someone who did not want to make an entrance but had no choice about arriving. She was setting the table when he came into the main room, and she looked up. He was 12, which she'd known, but 12 covered a lot of territory. This 12 was tall for his age, thin in the way boys get when they're growing faster than they're eating, with the same dark hair as his father and a jaw that was going to be exactly his father's jaw in about 5 years. He had dirt on his hands and a careful blankness on his face that Clara recognized immediately because she'd been a teacher for 9 years, and she knew exactly what that look meant. It meant, "I will not let you see anything until I decide whether you're worth seeing." "Ethan," Cole said from where he had settled at the head of the table, "this is Miss Whitmore." "Clara," she said. "You can call me Clara." Ethan looked at her. "Hello," he said. Flat. Not rude, just contained. "Hello." She kept her voice easy. "Wash up for supper." He went without argument. She filed that away. Supper was not comfortable. She hadn't expected it to be. Cole ate steadily, the way men eat when eating is primarily fuel, and answered Maggie's unending stream of questions in short sentences. Ethan ate without looking up from his plate, except when directly addressed. Clara ate and watched and tried to take stock without being obvious about it. The biscuits were good. She knew that much. Maggie ate 3, which was a lot for someone her size. Cole ate 4 without commenting, which she decided counted as a compliment. "These are different than Mrs. Aldridge's," Maggie said, which was apparently meant as high praise. "Maggie," Cole said. "What? They are. Hers were kind of flat. You don't have to—" "It's fine," Clara said, and it was. "Different isn't bad." Maggie looked satisfied. Ethan hadn't looked up. After supper, Clara washed the dishes. Cole offered to help, and she told him there was no need. He stood in the doorway for a moment anyway, seeming uncertain whether to push the point, and then went out to check the stock. Maggie sat at the kitchen table again, watching Clara wash up the way she seemed to watch everything. Fully attentive. Small face, serious. "Are you staying?" Maggie asked. Clara rinsed a bowl. "That's the plan." "But are you really staying?" She looked at the child. Maggie was looking at her with an expression that had something nakedly anxious in it. The particular anxiety of someone who has been told something before and then had it not be true. "I'm planning on it," Clara said. "I didn't come this far to leave." Maggie seemed to turn this over for a moment. "Mrs. Aldridge said she'd stay," she said, and then she left. I know. That must have been hard. It was. Maggie said this as a plain fact. And before her, there was Mrs. Donahue, who stayed for 6 weeks and then said it was too much for her. Clara dried her hands on the dish towel. I've been a school teacher for 9 years, she said. I've managed rooms full of children in all states of behavior in all kinds of weather. I've taught children who didn't want to learn, and children who couldn't sit still, and children who cried every day for a month until they didn't. I'm not easy to run off. Maggie looked at her for a long moment. Really? Really? Another pause. Then Maggie slid down from her chair, crossed the kitchen with the purposefulness of someone who has made a decision, and put her arms around Clara's waist. Just like that, without warning. Clara stood very still. Her hands came up, slowly, and settled on the child's back. They stayed like that for a moment, and then Maggie let go and went to find her father, and Clara turned back to the sink and finished drying the dishes, and did not let herself feel too much about it because it was the first day and she was tired, and she knew better than to build something on one day. But she held it. Cole showed her the property the next morning, which she was grateful for because she needed to understand what she'd come to. He wasn't chatty about it. He pointed things out and named them and told her what needed attention without editorializing much. But she was a fast study and she had questions, and by the time they'd covered the barn and the outbuildings and the kitchen garden and the north fence line, she had a reasonable working map in her head. The cattle go out to the east pasture in spring, he said. We've got 40 head right now, coming up from 30 a couple years ago. 2 hired hands, Frank Desser and Pete Holt. They bunk in the barn. Good workers. How's the water situation? He glanced at her. The well's reliable. Creek runs about a mile north, but we don't depend on it. And the garden? She'd looked at it the evening before and had some thoughts. Hasn't been kept up the way it should, he said. Wasn't anyone's main job after Eleanor. He stopped. It fell behind. It can be brought back, she said. Some of it. I'd want to look at what's salvageable. He was quiet for a moment. You know about gardens? I kept one in Ohio. Not the same climate, but the principles are similar. He nodded. Not enthusiastic, just acknowledging. She was learning that this was how he processed most things. A nod, a pause, and then you'd find out later whether it had registered. The east pasture was genuinely beautiful, in the particular way of working land. The grass not lush but present. The cattle steady and heavy-looking in the morning light, the sky overhead doing that Wyoming thing where it went on too long. She stood at the fence and looked at it. It's good land, she said. Yes, he said, and for the first time there was something in his voice that wasn't just practical, something that sounded like how a person sounds when they're talking about something they love. It is. She looked at him sideways. He was watching his cattle with an expression that was easier to read than the ones he wore in the house. Something straightforward and unguarded on his face, just briefly. She looked away before he noticed she was looking. The first week was mostly information gathering. She was new to everything. The rhythms of the house, the personalities of the children, the way the ranch operated, the 1,000 small details that made up a life she was supposed to step into as though she'd always been part of it. She made mistakes. She put the kitchen things in places Cole couldn't find them without looking and had to be told where they'd been. She didn't know the stove well enough and oversalted a soup. She wasn't sure how to be with Ethan, who was polite in a way that made it clear he was choosing to be polite and could choose otherwise if he decided to. She'd been a teacher long enough to know not to push at a closed door. She observed. She noticed that Ethan did his chores without being asked, that he was careful with the animals, that he read when he had the chance and got irritated when Maggie interrupted him, that he was under the careful blankness, not unkind. One afternoon she found him in the barn with a horse that had been favoring its left foreleg. He was crouched down, examining it, with a seriousness of focus she recognized. "What do you think?" she asked from the barn door. He looked up. "Bruised, probably. Nothing broken. I'll put a poultice on it." "Where'd you learn that?" "My father." He straightened up, watchful. "He taught me." "You know a lot about horses?" "Some." He looked at her steadily. "You don't have to—" He stopped. "Don't have to what?" "Talk to me." "You don't have to talk to me just because you're supposed to." She considered this. "I wasn't talking to you because I'm supposed to," she said. I was asking because you clearly know something I don't. He looked at her for a moment. Uncertain, she thought, about whether to believe her. Arnica, he said finally. For the poultice. It works better than anything else. I'll remember that, she said. She left him to it. Cole was harder to read than his children, which was saying something because Ethan was not easy. He was civil, consistently, genuinely civil, which was more than she'd necessarily expected. But there was a quality of distance to him that she couldn't quite account for. Not coldness. Something more like caution. Like a man who has learned to not say a thing before he's decided he means it. She found that paradoxically easier to manage than someone who talked more than they meant. She was direct by nature. She asked what she needed to know and didn't dress it up much. He responded to that. The fence on the north line, she said one morning when he came in for breakfast. The third post from the corner is loose. I noticed it when we walked it. He stopped, looked at her. When did you walk the fence? Yesterday, while you were out with the hands. She poured the coffee. I wanted to know what needed doing. He was quiet for a moment. I've been meaning to get to it. I know. You've got 40 other things you're getting to first. I just wanted to flag it. He took the coffee and sat down, and she thought she saw something shift in his expression, something that wasn't quite surprise but was in that neighborhood, before he set it aside. Thank you, he said. And meant it, she thought. That was a man who said thank you when he meant it, and didn't when he didn't. She filed that away, too. The first time things came close to real conversation between them was in the evening of the 9th day, which she knew was the 9th day because she'd been counting in the small, private way of someone keeping track of how long they've been somewhere new. The children were in bed. She was at the kitchen table mending Maggie's second-best dress, which had caught on something and torn at the sleeve seam. Cole came in from the barn later than usual, washed his hands at the pump, and sat down at the far end of the table with a mug of coffee he poured himself. For a while they just sat in the quiet of it. She sewed. He sat with his coffee. The lamp between them put out a low, steady light. She talked to you, he said. She looked up. He was looking at the table, not at her. Maggie? About staying. He turned the mug in his hands. She told me. What you said to her about not being easy to run off. Clara set down the dress. She's had people leave, she said. She wanted to know if I would too. What she wanted was a promise I can't make for you. I know. I didn't promise. I told her I planned to stay. He was quiet. Is that a problem? She asked. No. He looked up then and met her eyes directly, and she saw something in his face that was neither comfortable nor performative, just genuine and unresolved. It's just... He stopped, started again. The last two women who tried this, they meant it too when they said they'd stay. I don't think they lied. I think they just didn't know. What didn't they know? How hard it is, he said plainly. This place, the work, the isolation, He shook his head. I'm not saying that to discourage you. I'm saying it because I think you should know what I know. I appreciate that. She picked up the dress again. For what it's worth, I've been here 9 days, and I'm not looking to leave. 9 days isn't a long time. No, she agreed. It isn't. She found the thread and made a stitch. But you also said my letter was the most straightforward you'd received. I didn't write it to seem like something I'm not. I'm not going to stop being straightforward now just because I'm here instead of there. He looked at her for a long moment. The lamp put shadows on his face, along the lines around his eyes, the corner of his jaw. He looked, she thought, like a man who was used to carrying things and had learned to do it without showing the strain too much. Fair enough, he said. They sat in the quiet again. She finished the sleeve seam and started on the hem. He drank his coffee. Outside, something, probably a coyote, far out, made a sound that came across the open ground and thinned out into nothing. Your husband, Cole said. Not pressing, just opening a door and leaving it open. George, she said. He was a good man, very funny, which surprised people because he was quiet. He taught me to play chess. I wasn't very good at it. She made a stitch. He was sick for a while before it took him. Not long enough to say goodbye properly, but long enough that it wasn't a surprise. I know that feeling, Cole said. I imagine you do. Eleanor was... He stopped. She was not quiet. She was the kind of person who filled up a room without trying, and then she was gone in the room. He shook his head. I didn't know what to do with how quiet everything got. I know that too, Clara said. They looked at each other across the lamp. This is a strange thing, he said. What we're doing. Yes, she agreed. It is. I don't know how to do it right, he said. And it cost him something to say it, she could tell. This was not a man who admitted uncertainty easily, not because he was proud, but because he was genuinely more comfortable with what he knew how to do than with what he didn't. I don't either, she said. I expect we'll figure it out as we go. He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded. That particular nod of his that she was beginning to understand meant, I've heard you, I'm taking it in, I'll let you know what I decide. And he finished his coffee and said goodnight and went to bed. Clara sat at the table for another 20 minutes, finishing the hem by lamplight. She thought about 11 days of travel, about the letter she'd almost not sent, about Maggie's arms around her waist and Ethan's careful blankness and Cole's face in the lamplight, and the way this place that was not hers yet was starting to feel not hers, but not entirely foreign either. Not home? Not yet. But possibly, she thought. Possibly if she was patient and honest and not afraid of hard work, and she wasn't afraid of hard work, that much she knew about herself. Possibly, in time. She put the dress aside, folded it neatly, and went to her room in the back of the house. The window was thin, and the night air came through around the frame, cool and smelling of grass and open land and something indefinable that was just Wyoming, just this place, just here. She lay down on the narrow bed and she was asleep inside of 3 minutes, which was perhaps the most honest thing her body had said about anything since she'd arrived. The second week was harder than the first, and not for the reasons Clara had expected. The first week had been about learning. The stove's temperament, the layout of the larder, which drawer the good knife was in and which one had the broken handle she needed to work around. Learning had kept her busy in a way that had its own momentum. The second week, she knew enough to see the full scope of what needed doing, and the full scope was considerable. It wasn't just the garden, though the garden alone was a project. Half of what had been planted was past salvaging. The squash had gone to rot at the root, and someone had let the weeds take over the bean rows so thoroughly that she spent an entire morning on her knees pulling them out, and still wasn't done. The other half, the carrots, most of the onions, a stubborn and somewhat miraculous row of turnips, was retrievable if she moved fast, and she moved fast. It wasn't just the house, though the house had accumulated the particular disorder of a place where capable hands had been managing things rather than tending them. There's a difference. Managing means nothing falls apart entirely. Tending means things get better. No one had been tending the Mercer house in some time, and Clara could see it in the grime settled into the corners of the window frames. The curtain that had lost a ring and been left hanging crooked for long enough that the fabric had started to conform to the angle. The pantry shelves had been stocked without much system, which meant things got pushed to the back and forgotten. She found a tin of molasses behind 3 other tins that was at least a year old, and a partial sack of cornmeal that had gone to moths. She worked through it steadily and without making noise about it, because she'd been raised to believe that announcing your work was not the same as doing it. What was harder than the house and the garden was Ethan. Not that he was cruel, he wasn't. He was scrupulously polite in the way of someone who has been told that politeness is required and has decided to provide exactly that. No more and no less. He said good morning and good evening. He answered questions when she asked them. He ate what she put in front of him without complaint and said thank you at the end of the meal, which he clearly meant genuinely even if he didn't mean anything else. But he watched her. Not with hostility, exactly. More with the quality of attention of someone waiting to see what would happen, reserving his judgment until there was enough evidence to act on. She understood it. She did. He was 12 years old and he had watched his mother die and he had watched 2 other women come through this house and leave. And he wasn't going to let himself be caught caring about someone else until he was absolutely certain that caring was safe. She would have felt the same, she thought, at 12, after all that. Understanding it didn't make it easier to be on the receiving end of. She tried not to push. She'd learned enough about him in the first week to know that pushing would be exactly the wrong thing, that his withdrawal was not stubbornness so much as self-protection, And you don't solve self-protection by battering at it. You solve it by making the world gradually safer until the person inside it stops needing to protect themselves quite so much. So she worked around him. She asked his opinion on practical things because he had good opinions on practical things, and it gave them something neutral to stand on together. She didn't ask him about his mother. She didn't ask him about his feelings. She asked him about the horse with the bruised foreleg and how the poultice was coming and whether he thought the north pasture grass would hold up if they had a dry spell. He answered her, carefully, still. But he answered. One afternoon, about 10 days in, she was at the kitchen table working through the household accounts, which Cole had handed her without ceremony, along with an expression that suggested some relief at handing them to someone else. The ledger was not a disaster. Cole was careful with money. She could see that clearly enough. But it hadn't been kept up in a few months, and some of the entries were cryptic in a way that suggested the person who'd written them had expected to remember what they meant, and then hadn't. She was working through it methodically, making notes in the margin in pencil where she needed clarification, when Ethan came in from outside and stopped in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the ledger, then at her. "What are you doing?" he asked, trying to figure out what this entry says. She tilted the ledger toward him so he could see. "Your father wrote it. I think it might say Hendricks, but the H looks like it could be an R." Ethan crossed the kitchen without quite being invited and looked at the ledger. "Hendricks," he said. "That's the man who sold us the fencing material in April. He always writes the invoice by hand, and it's worse than my father's. So the amount here, that was the deposit. The rest got paid in June." He pointed to another entry. "That one." "Ah." She made a note. "That makes more sense." He stood there for a moment, not leaving, looking at the ledger. She let the silence sit. "Mrs. Aldridge couldn't do the accounts," he said, in a tone that wasn't quite conversational and wasn't quite anything else. "No?" "She said she wasn't good with numbers. My father had to do them himself on top of everything else." "I taught arithmetic for 9 years, Clara said. Numbers don't bother me." He was quiet. Then, "Are you going to stay?" She looked up at him. He was looking at the ledger, not at her, but the question had come out without its usual careful casing around it. There was something more open in the way he'd asked it, something that reminded her briefly of how young he actually was. "I'm not planning to leave," she said. "That's not the same thing." "No," she agreed. "It's not." She closed the ledger. "I can't promise you something I don't control. What I can tell you is that I have nowhere else to go back to. I sold everything I owned in Ohio to come here. That tends to concentrate a person's intentions." He looked at her then. Something turned over in his expression, not softened exactly, but changed, like a door on a loose hinge moving slightly in a wind. He didn't say anything else. He went out the back to do his afternoon chores, but the next morning at breakfast he told her, without being asked, that the fence post she'd flagged in the north line had been fixed because he'd gone ahead and done it after school. She said, "That was good thinking." He said, "It needed doing." They left it there. Cole was harder to understand. He was, she was increasingly certain, a good man, not in a soft or uncomplicated way, but in the way of someone who has decided what kind of person they're going to be and then lives that decision out in the actual texture of their days. He was fair with his hands. He was patient with Maggie, even when Maggie was testing every boundary available to her, which was frequently. He worked very hard and didn't seem to think much about whether anyone noticed, which was either admirable or the result of years of nobody noticing. She couldn't tell which, but there was something he did that she hadn't quite named yet, which was that he would start to be present, really present, not just physically in the room, and then pull back. She'd see it happen. They'd be talking, really talking, not about ranch logistics, but about something that actually mattered. And something would shift in his face, and he'd find a reason to end the conversation. Go check the stock. Remembered something that needed doing. She didn't take it personally, or tried not to. She just noted it. 3 weeks in, she understood it better. She'd been in the barn looking for a particular tool she'd been told was somewhere in there, a hand sickle she wanted for the garden, when she found the photograph. It was tucked behind a shelf bracket, which was a strange place for a photograph. But then she thought probably it hadn't been put there deliberately, just slid behind when something else was moved and nobody had noticed. She almost put it back. She looked at it. A woman standing outside the ranch house, recognizably the same house, though in the photograph it looked newer or perhaps just better kept. The woman was dark-haired and pretty in a vivid, animated way. You could tell even from a still photograph that she'd been the kind of person who moved through a room like weather. She was smiling at whoever was holding the camera, and the smile was the kind you can't really manufacture, the kind that comes from actually being delighted. Clara looked at the photograph for a moment. Then she tucked it back where she'd found it, found the hand sickle on the opposite wall where it had always been, and went back to the garden. She thought about it, though, off and on through the day. Eleanor Mercer had not been a ghost. Clara hadn't felt haunted by her presence in the house, hadn't felt like she was walking into a shrine. But she was present in other ways. In Ethan's jawline, in Maggie's particular way of tilting her head when she was thinking, in the slight flinch Cole did sometimes when something reminded him suddenly of something else. She was present in the house the way missing people are, which is not the same as being there, but is not nothing either. Clara didn't resent it. She had her own version of it. She still thought about George sometimes with a sharp, clear grief. Not constant, not overwhelming, just there, the way a scar is there, something you've stopped noticing most of the time, but that your hand finds without thinking. What she thought about was simpler, that Cole was a man who had loved someone very much, and she had died, and loving someone else was going to feel like something he hadn't yet decided was allowed. She didn't know what to do with that knowledge, except hold it carefully. It was around the end of the third week that she fixed the curtain rod. This was not a significant event. She noticed the rod had pulled loose from the wall, found the tools she needed in the lean-to off the barn, and resecured it in about 20 minutes on a morning when Cole was out with the hands and the children were at school. She moved on. She had 14 other things to get to. That evening, Cole came in and stopped in the doorway of the sitting room and looked at the curtain, which was now hanging straight for the first time in what had clearly been a while given the crease in the fabric. He looked at it for a long moment. "When did you do that?" he said. "This morning. I had the tools out for something else anyway." He was quiet. She was setting the table for supper and she looked at him sideways and saw something on his face that she wasn't prepared for. Not gratitude exactly, though gratitude was part of it. Something more like being caught off guard. Something that looked like it might hurt, just slightly, in the way that small kindnesses sometimes hurt people who haven't been on the receiving end of them for a while. He said, "Thank you, Clara." It was the first time he'd used her name. She'd been Miss Whitmore, or sometimes just nothing, addressed without a name at all. She kept setting the table. "Of course," she said. Maggie, for her part, was straightforward in her demands and her affections, which Clara found refreshing even when it was exhausting. She wanted to be read to every night, and she was not shy about specifying which stories she wanted and which she did not. She wanted to help with cooking and needed to be given tasks that were real enough to feel meaningful, but not so complicated that they went badly, which required calibration. She wanted her hair done in 2 braids every morning, not one, not a bun, and she was specific about the braids not being too tight because last time someone had done them too tight, it had pulled. "Hold still," Clara said one morning, working the second braid. "I am holding still." "You're talking. Talking doesn't move my head." "It moves your head when you're 5. Maggie made a sound of profound disagreement, but held somewhat stiller. Clara finished the braid and tied it off, and Maggie turned around to face her with the expression of someone submitting to a quality inspection. "Both the same?" she asked. Clara checked. They were near enough. "Near enough," she said. "I want them the same." "They are the same." "Are you sure?" "Maggie." "Okay." Maggie hopped off the chair. "Mrs. Aldridge always did one tighter than the other." "I'm not Mrs. Aldridge." "No." Maggie was already heading for the door, the braid swinging perfectly even behind her. "You're better at braids." It was such a small thing. Clara knew it was a small thing, but she stood in the kitchen for a second after Maggie had gone out, and she felt she didn't quite have a word for it. Not happiness, exactly. Something more like the particular feeling of a thing fitting where it's supposed to go. Cole found her in his garden one afternoon, elbow deep in the soil around the carrot row. He'd come back from town earlier than she'd expected. She heard the wagon before she saw him, and she looked up with dirt on her hands and what was probably dirt on her face because she'd pushed her hair back at some point without thinking. He stood at the edge of the garden and looked at what she'd done. She'd reclaimed about 2/3 of it. The salvageable beds were cleared and tended, the carrot row producing small but determined roots, the onion patch looking considerably healthier than it had. She'd put in a new row of late-season beans that were optimistic but might make it if the weather held. The hopeless third, the squash and the oldest beds, she'd turned over and left, because there's a difference between a recovery and a miracle, and she'd been a practical person long enough not to confuse them. "You did all this yourself," he said. Not quite a question. "Mostly." She sat back on her heels. Maggie helped with the bean seeds. She dropped more than she planted, but she was very serious about it. The corner of his mouth moved, the slightest thing. She'd have missed it if she hadn't been looking. "She's going to want to be there for the harvest," he said. "I know. I told her she could." She pulled another weed she'd missed. "What happened to the squash? Was it always like that, or did something get to it?" "Borer, probably. Happened last summer, too, toward the end." He paused. "Eleanor always planted the squash at the other end, away from the fence. I think it did better there." Another pause. "I should have—" He stopped. "You had a lot of other things," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I kept thinking I'd get to it," he said. "The garden, the curtain rod, half a dozen other things. And then another week would go and I'd still be—" He shook his head. "I'm not complaining. I'm just—" "I know," she said. He looked at her. She was looking at the carrot row and not at him, but she felt him looking. "Clara," he said. She looked up. "I don't know if I've said—" He stopped, started again, with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing words with more precision than he usually needed. "You've done more here in 3 weeks than I'd managed in 6 months. I want you to know that I see it." She held his gaze for a moment. The afternoon light was behind him, and his face was in shadow, and she couldn't read his expression as well as she wanted to. "Thank you," she said. "That matters." He nodded. He started to turn, then stopped. "I'm going to fix the porch board," he said. "The one on the left side, near the step." She'd pointed that out to him in the first week, in passing, the way she'd mentioned the fence post. She'd assumed he'd noted it and filed it, and it would get to it when it got to it. "I'd been meaning to," he said, and it came out with a slight roughness, like an admission he hadn't quite planned to make. "Good," she said. Just that. He went back to the house. She heard about 20 minutes later the sound of a hammer. She kept working in the garden until the light changed and the air went cool the way it did out here in the evenings, dropping 10 degrees faster than seemed possible, and then she washed her hands at the pump and went in to start supper. The porch board was solid underfoot when she crossed it. 4 weeks into her time at the ranch, she sat down one evening and tried to take stock honestly. She'd come here in something like desperation. She hadn't told herself that at the time, but sitting in the kitchen now with the lamp burning low, she could admit it. She'd been 31 and alone and scared in a way that was slow building and quiet. Not dramatic, just the steady realization that the life she'd planned wasn't the life she had anymore. And she didn't know what the new plan was supposed to be. The advertisement had been a chance, and she'd taken it, and she'd told herself it was practical, and it was practical, but that wasn't all it was. She'd come here needing something too, not just to give. The question she'd been asking herself, quietly, in the small hours when she woke and couldn't get back to sleep, the question was whether it was becoming something, not what she'd imagined, because she hadn't let herself imagine anything specific, which was a form of protection she was now grateful for. But something. The household was running better than it had been. The children, Maggie openly, Ethan at a slow and careful angle, were warming to her. The work was hard and constant, but she'd never been afraid of hard and constant work, only of aimless work, work with no weight to it. Coal was complicated. She didn't know quite what coal was, which was not nothing, she told herself. Not knowing was different from nothing. Not knowing meant there was still something to find out. She heard his boots on the porch and then the door, and she closed the ledger she'd been pretending to review and stood up to put the lamp out. "You don't have to go in," he said from the doorway. She looked at him. He looked tired, the kind of tired that's been building for a long time and just shows up on a person's face as a kind of heaviness. "I wasn't," she said. "I was just done with the accounts." He came in and hung up his hat and sat down heavily in the chair at the end of the table. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at them. She sat back down. Hard day? She asked. Pete's horse threw a shoe and we lost 2 hours of work we didn't have to lose, he said. And the Daggett brothers have been putting cattle on the eastern boundary again, which... He stopped. You don't need to hear about this. You can tell me if you want to, she said. He looked at her. The lamp was between them again, the way it had been that night she'd told him about George, and she thought about how this was already a habit, this sitting together in the late evening quiet. When it had become a habit, she wasn't sure, but it had. The Daggerts have been pushing their boundary line for 2 years, he said, moving fence stakes, running their cattle onto my eastern pasture, and then claiming the stake had always been there. He shook his head. I've got the original survey records. My lawyer in Cheyenne has copies, but it's a slow process, and meanwhile they're grazing my grass and acting like they own half my water rights. Is there anyone in town who... The sheriff knows, he said. He's not bought, I don't think, but the Daggerts are his neighbors too, and he's not in a hurry to make enemies. He exhaled. I've been managing it. I'm just tired of managing it. She thought about that, about the kind of tired it produces, managing something that should be resolved, carrying it week after week, because there's no good resolution yet available. For what it's worth, she said, if you need someone to look at the survey records and compare them to what's there now, I can do that. I'm good at maps. I was always good at maps. He looked at her across the lamp. You were a school teacher, he said, not doubtfully, just checking. School teachers teach everything, she said. Reading, arithmetic, history, geography. I can read a survey, and I can read a land description, and I can read what's supposed to be there and what isn't. He was quiet for a long moment. I'll bring the records out, he said, whenever you're ready. He nodded. The lamp flickered slightly, some draft somewhere she hadn't found yet, and steadied again. Clara, he said, then stopped. She waited. I'm glad you came, he said. Not easily. She could tell it cost him something, saying it plainly, being that direct about something that wasn't ranch logistics. I want you to know that. She looked at him across the lamp and the table and the 4 weeks of ordinary mornings and difficult evenings and small, significant moments between them, and she thought, yes, something is becoming something. I'm glad I came too, she said. He held her eyes for a moment. Then he got up and said goodnight and went to bed. She sat at the table a while longer. The lamp burned down to the point where she should put it out, and she put it out, and she sat in the dark for a minute listening to the sound of Wyoming at night, the wind far away and the deep silence underneath it. And she thought that you could get used to a place like this, that you could, given enough time and enough ordinary days, stop feeling like a stranger in it. She went to bed. Outside, the wind crossed the open ground and moved through the grass, and the ranch sat quiet under the enormous dark sky, just a collection of shapes against the stars, no different than it had been the day she arrived. But it felt different. It felt increasingly like somewhere. The survey records turned out to be exactly as bad as Cole had implied, and somewhat worse than Clara had expected. She spread them across the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning. The original documents and a rough copy Cole had made himself at some point, and she spent the better part of 2 hours going over them with the care she'd once given to student examination papers, methodically, without rushing, noting discrepancies in the margins in pencil. Cole sat across from her for the first half hour, then got up to do something outside, then came back and stood in the kitchen doorway watching her work. Well, he said when she finally set down her pencil. They moved it at least 60 feet, she said, possibly more. The survey describes a creek bend as the eastern boundary marker, and the creek bend is here, she pointed to the map. But the fence stake you told me about is considerably east of that. She looked up at him. This is documented. Anyone who can read a survey description can see it. I know that, he said. My lawyer knows that. Then what's the problem? The problem is that the Daggerts have been in this territory for 20 years, and their cousin is on the territorial land board. He came the rest of the way into the kitchen and stood looking at the documents. It's not about what's right. It's about how long it takes to make what's right actually mean something. She understood that. It didn't make it less frustrating. Is there anything that would speed it up? Another set of documentation, maybe? Someone else's witness to where the stake was originally. He exhaled. There was a man, Harlan Briggs. He ran a small claim about 3 miles north. He remembered when my father-in-law put the original fence in, but Briggs moved to Montana 2 years ago. Can you reach him in Montana? Cole looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, the particular look of a man who has been carrying a problem long enough that he's stopped seeing certain aspects of it. I could write to him, he said slowly. If he'd put it in writing, it would be something. He picked up the survey document and looked at it. Yeah, it would be something. He set it back down. I don't know why I didn't think of that. You've had 40 other things, she said, which was what he'd said to her about the garden, and she saw him register that. A brief flicker of something in his face that was almost amusement, almost something else. I'll write tonight, he said. She started folding the documents back into order. He watched her do it. You'd have been a good lawyer, he said. School teachers mostly are, she said. We just don't get paid like one. That sound from him again, Paul, the almost laugh, the thing that lived just at the edge of a real one. She filed it away with the other things she was accumulating about Cole Mercer. That he took his hat off before he came inside, always, even when he was in a hurry. That he drank his coffee with no sugar, but would sometimes steal a spoonful of Maggie's when she wasn't looking. That he was better with his children than he thought he was, though he worried constantly that he wasn't good enough. She'd heard him through the wall, one night, when Maggie had woken from a bad dream, his voice low and even in the dark, not saying anything particular, just the sound of a father being present for a frightened child, steady and unhurried. She'd lain in her narrow bed and listened and thought, there it is. There's the part of this man that explains the rest of him. The 5th week brought a cold snap that moved in from the north without much warning and dropped the temperature 20 degrees overnight. Clara found the gap in her window frame that she'd suspected since the first week, stuffed it with a strip of old flannel she found in the mending basket, and moved on. The children needed heavier clothes pulled from the storage chest, and Maggie's winter coat from last year was genuinely too small. Clara let it out at the seams as far as it would go, which bought another season, but not a comfortable one. She needs a new coat, Clara told Cole that evening. I know, he said. I'll get to town before it gets colder. I can make one, she said. If you have the material, it would be faster than waiting for a trip to town, and it'd fit her properly. He looked at her with that assessing quality again. You can make a coat? I sewed all my own clothes for 10 years, she said, and half my students when their families couldn't. A child's coat isn't complicated. He was quiet for a moment. Then, there's wool in the storage chest. Dark green, I think. Eleanor bought it but never got around to... He stopped. I'll look at it tomorrow, she said, and let it rest there. The wool was good quality, heavy and tightly woven. Eleanor Mercer had known what she was buying. Clara spent an evening taking Maggie's measurements while Maggie stood on a chair in the kitchen and provided running commentary on everything she planned to do once the coat was finished, all of which involved being outside in weather that the coat would protect her from. Clara made notes and said in the appropriate places and felt, with a clarity that was quiet but definite, that this was where she was supposed to be. Not because it was comfortable. It wasn't, not entirely. Not because everything was resolved. Nothing was resolved. Not really. Not the Daggert situation, and not the careful distance Cole kept, and not Ethan's watchful waiting to see. But because she was useful here in a way that was specific to her, to who she was, and that specificity felt like something, like fit. The coat took 4 evenings. She worked on it after the children were in bed, at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up, and twice Cole sat across from her while she worked, not talking much, just present in the same space, which she'd come to understand was its own form of communication with him. The 3rd evening, he brought the letter to Harlan Briggs and read parts of it to her, asking whether she thought a particular sentence was clear enough. She said the 3rd paragraph was working too hard, and he should say the thing plainly, and he rewrote it, and it was better. You're good at this, he said. Editing? Years of student compositions. She made a stitch. Children will make any argument for anything if you let them. You get good at seeing where an argument doesn't hold. Is that what you're doing with me? She looked up. He was watching her with something that she'd been seeing more of lately, a directness that was slightly different from his usual kind of directness, more personal, like a question inside a question. No, she said. You're making a good argument. I'm just helping you make it more efficiently. He looked at her a moment longer. Then he looked back at the letter. "My father wrote letters like this," he said. "He could say a thing in 6 words that other men needed 20 for." He smoothed the paper on the table. "I never got that from him. Ethan has it more than I do." "Ethan's observant," she said. "He watches everything." "He watches you," Cole said. Not accusingly, just noting it. "I know." She worked the needle through. "I watch him back." Cole almost said something. She could see him start and stop. Whatever it was, he set it aside and went back to the letter. She had learned by now not to press when he did that. It wasn't avoidance, or it wasn't only avoidance. It was more like he needed time between a thing being real and being able to say it. She respected that mostly. Sometimes it tested her patience, but she'd always been better at patience than she gave herself credit for. She gave Maggie the coat on a Thursday morning before school. Maggie put it on and stood in the middle of the kitchen, turning slowly, which was unnecessary for evaluating a coat, but apparently felt right. Then she stopped turning and looked at Clara with an expression that was working hard to contain something larger than expression usually could hold. "It's the right green," Maggie said. "Good," Clara said. "How did you know it was the right green?" "I didn't. I guessed." Maggie considered this. "It's a good guess," she said, with the gravity of a senior official delivering a verdict. Then she crossed the kitchen and hugged Clara's arm. Not her waist this time, her arm, with a grip that was surprisingly strong for someone so small, and then let go and picked up her school bag and went out. Cole had been standing in the doorway again. She was becoming convinced that the man moved more quietly than any person his size had a right to. "She hasn't worn a green coat since," he started. She turned and found that he'd stopped, and there was something on his face that she hadn't seen before, or hadn't seen this openly. Grief and gratitude running into each other, making something that didn't quite have a name for itself. He pressed his mouth together and looked at the door Maggie had just gone through. "It was her mother's favorite color," he said. Claire didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that wouldn't land wrong. After a moment, he nodded once to himself and went outside. She heard him on the porch, just standing there for a moment, she thought, getting his feet under him. And then his boots on the steps, and he was gone to his day. She cleared the breakfast dishes and thought about Eleanor Mercer, and the wool that had never been made into anything, and all the ordinary things that get left undone when a person dies too young. She thought about George, who had bought her a good winter hat the November before he got sick, and how she still had the hat and still wore it. The dead don't leave. They just change what form they're present in. The Daggert situation came to a head unexpectedly, the way these things usually do. Clara had been in town, the first time she'd gone in on her own, with the wagon and a list of things needed at the dry goods store, when she ran into a woman named Ruth Sable at the store counter. Ruth was the wife of a neighboring rancher, somewhere in her mid-40s, with a direct manner that Clara recognized and appreciated. They'd met once before briefly when Ruth and her husband had come by the ranch on some piece of business. "How are you settling in?" Ruth asked in the tone of someone who actually wanted to know. "Well enough," Clara said. "It's a lot of work." "It always is." Ruth watched the store's proprietor measure out flour. "You're not what people expected." Clara looked at her. "What did they expect?" Ruth shrugged, not unkindly. "Someone softer, maybe. Or someone who'd last 2 weeks and go back east." She paused. "You fixed the kitchen garden." "Most of it." "I drove past 2 weeks ago, and it looked better than it has in 2 years." She tilted her head. Cole doesn't talk much about how things are going at the ranch, so people piece it together from what they can see. "Is that common out here? Everyone knowing everyone's business?" "Yes." "Everyone actually saying so?" "Less common." Ruth smiled slightly. "I'm telling you because you should know that people are watching, not badly, just you're new, and the Mercer situation has been a concern to some of us for a while now. Those children needed someone steady." Clara absorbed this. "I'm aware," she said. "The Daggerts," Ruth said, lowering her voice, though the store was nearly empty. "Hal Daggert was in here 2 days ago talking about that eastern boundary line, saying Cole was making things difficult by not accepting the new line." Clara kept her expression even. "What new line?" "Exactly." Ruth met her eyes. "The one they put in themselves." She waited a moment. "I thought you should know he's pushing harder lately. My husband thinks it's because they know Cole's been stretched thin the past couple years. Figured he wouldn't have the energy to fight properly. He's writing to a witness, Clara said. Someone who knew the original boundary. Something shifted in Ruth's face. Approval, she thought. Good, Ruth said. That's the right move. She picked up her own purchases. Tell Cole that my husband said the same, that Briggs is the right person to contact. He's been meaning to say so, but you know how men are about saying things. Clara did know. I'll tell him, she said. Team. She told him that evening and watched him take it in. The confirmation from another source that he was doing the right thing, which mattered to him even though he wouldn't say so. Sable said that, he repeated. Through Ruth, but yes. He nodded slowly. He's a careful man, Tom Sable. Doesn't say things unless he means them. Sounds familiar, she said, without thinking. Cole looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved. Was that about me? Take it however it applies, she said. He almost laughed. She was increasingly certain of this, that the almost laugh was the real one, and the contained version was just where it lived publicly, and that the gap between them was slowly, incrementally closing. I'll send the letter tomorrow, he said. Good. He was quiet for a moment. Thank you, he said. For going to town, for talking to Ruth. I needed flour anyway. She looked at him. You didn't have to bring it back to me like that, he said. You could have just gotten the flour. She held his gaze. I know, she said, but it mattered, so I did. He looked at her with that complicated expression, the one she still hadn't fully mapped, the one that sat somewhere between what he felt and what he'd decided to say about it. She was getting better at reading it, if not at predicting it. I'll start supper, she said, because it was that time and someone had to. Boy. 6 weeks in, and the evenings at the kitchen table had become so much a part of the rhythm of the house that she stopped noticing them as a separate thing and started to notice only when they were interrupted. One evening Cole was out late with a problem in the barn. One of the cattle had gotten into something and was showing symptoms of a blockage, and she sat at the table past 9 o'clock with the mending and realized she was waiting for the sound of his boots on the porch, in the same unconscious way she'd once waited for the mail. She put the mending down when she realized it and made herself look at it plainly. She was not a woman who misled herself when she could help it. She'd been a widow for 8 months, and she'd come here for practical reasons, and the practical reasons were still real and still good. But practical reasons were not the only thing currently operating, and she'd been a careful enough thinker to know that pretending otherwise was its own kind of dishonesty. She picked the mending back up. There was nothing to do with the information right now except hold it and be honest about it with herself, which she was. Whatever it was between them, the evening quiet, the small moments of candor, the way he'd said her name and meant it, she didn't know what to do with it yet, and she suspected he didn't either, and that was all right. She'd waited out harder things than uncertainty. He came in at 9:30, later than usual, with hay on his jacket and the tired look of someone who'd been managing something unpleasant. She got up without discussion and put the kettle on. How is it? She said. Better? He sat down heavily. Pete knew what to do. I just needed to stay with it. She made the coffee and brought it to him and sat back down across the table and went back to the mending. And he wrapped both hands around the mug and said nothing for a while, and that was all right too. Maggie wore the coat again today, he said after a while. I noticed. She told Ethan you made it yourself. He drank the coffee. He didn't say anything, but he looked... He paused. He looked like it meant something to him. Clara kept her eyes on the mending. He'll say so when he's ready. Yeah. Cole turned the mug in his hands. That's the most I've hoped for with him in a while. Just that he'll say something when he's ready. She looked up at that. He's angry, Cole said, not self-pityingly, just factually. Not at me, I don't think. Or not only at me, just at the situation. What happened? He was 9 when Eleanor died, and he understood too much of it, and he stopped. He never cried. Not where I saw. He just got quieter and more careful and started making sure everything was done before I asked, like he could fix it somehow, if he was useful enough. His jaw tightened briefly. I don't know how to reach that. I try and I don't know if I'm doing it right. You're doing it, she said. That's not nothing. It doesn't always feel like enough. It rarely does. She set down the mending because this deserved her full attention. He knows you're there, Cole. That's what the caretaking is. That's him staying close in the only way he knows how right now. Children do that when they're scared. They make themselves useful because useful feels safe. Cole looked at her. You think he's scared? I think he's been scared for 3 years, and he's 12, and he's doing a remarkable job of holding himself together. She paused. And I think he's starting to let it down a little, just slightly, at the edges, which means something is working, even if it doesn't feel like it. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind picked up briefly, and the window in the main room rattled in its frame. She'd been meaning to get to that one, and then settled. You see things, he said. I've had a lot of practice looking, she said. 9 years of other people's children. You learn what you're actually seeing versus what the surface is. And with me, he said, carefully, like a man walking onto uncertain ground and knowing it and walking there anyway. She looked at him across the lamp and the coffee and the evening quiet that had become its own kind of language between them. I see someone who works very hard and worries very much about whether he's doing it right, she said, and doesn't say things before he means them, which I respect. And, he said, because there was an and he clearly knew it, and apparently tonight he was asking. She held his eyes. And I see someone who... She stopped, started differently. I came here for practical reasons, she said, and those reasons are still good, but I'm aware that the situation has become something beyond the practical. For me. She kept her voice even. I'm not saying that to create a problem. I'm saying it because I don't lie about things I know to be true, and I think you'd rather know. The lamp between them burned steady and small. Cole set down his mug. He looked at his hands on the table. When he looked back up at her, there was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not the careful management or the contained expression, but something underneath both of those, something that lived deeper and was harder to put a wall around. I'm not good at this, he said. I haven't been good at this since... He stopped. I knew Eleanor for 6 years before she died. 6 years, and I still don't think I said things as well as I should have while she was here. He shook his head. I'm not going to... I don't want to do that again, not say things because I don't know how, and then say them imperfectly, she said. I'm not looking for eloquence. He looked at her. I mean that, she said. I'm a practical person. Imperfect and said is better than perfect and not. Something in him shifted. She could see it happen. Something moving behind his eyes, some held thing releasing, not completely, not all at once, but enough. I think about you, he said. During the day, what you'll say about something, what you'll have noticed. He said it simply, like a man stating a fact he's verified, which she understood was exactly how it felt to him. I don't know what to do with that yet. You don't have to do anything with it right now, she said. It's been 6 weeks. I know. That's not... He exhaled. That's not a long time. No, she agreed. It isn't. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he picked up his mug, found it empty, and stood up to take it to the sink. I'm going to write the letter to Briggs tonight, he said, before I lose the wording. Good, she said. She picked up the mending again. He got the paper from the drawer in the main room and came back and sat at the other end of the table and wrote. She mended. The lamp burned between them. It was not resolved. Nothing was resolved. But she thought, this is what it looks like when two careful people decide to stop pretending they feel less than they do. Not dramatic, not clean, just real. Two people sitting at a kitchen table in Wyoming with a lamp between them, saying true things in small increments and trusting the accumulation of small true things to build towards something worth having. It was Ethan who broke it open. She hadn't seen it coming, which in retrospect she should have, because it was always the person you're not watching most closely who catches you off guard. She'd been so careful with Ethan, so patient, giving him room, and she'd thought he was thawing, slowly, at the edges. She hadn't realized the thaw had reached someplace deeper than the edges. It was a Sunday afternoon, gray and cold. Cole was in the barn with Pete dealing with a fence repair that had gotten pushed from the week before. Maggie was asleep. She still napped on Sundays, though she'd die before admitting it. And Clara was at the kitchen table with a book she'd brought from Ohio, the first time she'd had a proper hour to herself in weeks. Ethan came in from outside, shucked his coat, and stood in the kitchen doorway. He looked like someone who had been working up to something for a while. She put her finger in the book to hold her place. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Sure," she said. He came and sat down at the table, not across from her but at the corner, which was closer than he usually positioned himself. He put his hands flat on the table the way his father did. "Do you actually want to be here?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said. "Not just because you don't have anywhere else." "That's a fair distinction," she said. "Both things are true. I don't have anywhere else to go back to, and I want to be here. They're not in conflict." He considered this. "How can you want to be somewhere you've only been 6 weeks? How can you know you don't want to go somewhere you've never been?" she said. "It works both ways. Sometimes you know things before the evidence is complete." He looked at his hands. She waited. "My father," he started, then stopped. "You can say it," she said. "My father acts like it doesn't matter," he said. "You being here. He acts like it's just practical, arrangement. And maybe it is. I don't know, but..." He looked up. "Maggie talks about you like..." He stopped again. "Like what?" He pressed his mouth together. He was working at something, she could tell. Something that had been stuck and was trying to come loose. "Like you're her mother," he said. "She doesn't say it like that, but she means it like that. And I just..." His voice went slightly rough. "I want to know if you're going to leave before she gets too..." He stopped. Clara closed her book entirely and set it aside. "Ethan," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not going to leave," she said. And then, because he deserved the fuller truth, "I know you've heard that before from people who meant it and then did anyway. I know there's nothing I can say that will make that a certainty for you, because nothing is certain. But I will tell you what I told Maggie, which is that I sold everything I had to come here, and I have built nothing since then except here, and I don't know how to want somewhere else." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face, that careful blankness she'd spent 6 weeks being patient with, was showing its seams. Underneath it, he was just a boy who had been trying very hard not to need things because needing things had hurt him badly before. "The other thing," he said, "my father, he swallowed. "He's different since you came. He's less..." He shook his head. "He doesn't look as tired." "That's the work getting shared," she said. "No," Ethan said, with a directness that was startlingly adult. "It's not just the work." She held his gaze. "He watches you," Ethan said. "The same way he used to watch my mother, like he's making sure you're still there." The kitchen was very quiet. "Does that bother you?" she asked. He thought about it honestly, which she respected. "It used to," he said. "I thought it meant he was forgetting. But I don't think that's it. I don't think that's what this is." "No," she said quietly. "It's not." He nodded. He looked back at his hands on the table, then looked up one more time. "You and my father," he said, "you're both acting like this is just an arrangement. And everyone else..." He gestured vaguely, meaning the household, the family, the whole 6 weeks of ordinary days. "Everyone else is already acting like it's a family, except the two of you." Clara looked at Ethan for a long moment. She thought of the lamp on the table at night, Cole saying, "I think about you during the day," the coat in green wool, the curtain rod, the survey records, the almost laugh. 6 weeks of small, true things adding up to something neither of them had said out loud yet. "You might be right," she said. He shrugged, in the way of someone who knows they're right and is trying not to make a big thing of it. "I just think..." He stopped, then quietly, "I wouldn't mind. If it was a family, for real." She looked at this boy, this careful, guarded, brave 12-year-old who had worked so hard not to need anything, and felt something break open in her chest in a way that was not entirely comfortable and was entirely worth it. "I wouldn't mind either," she said. He nodded. He stood up from the table, pushed the chair back, and for a moment just stood there, and she thought he was going to say something else. But instead he crossed the kitchen and did something she hadn't expected. He stopped next to her chair and put his hand briefly on her shoulder. Just for a second, barely there. And then he went down the hall to his room. Clara sat at the table with her hand over her mouth and her eyes at the ceiling for a solid minute. Then she wiped her face, picked up her book, and went out to the porch to wait for Cole to come back from the barn, because Ethan was right, and they had both known it for some time, and it was past time for someone to say so out loud. The air was cold and sharp, and the sky was going gray at the edges, and she stood on the porch in the coat she'd worn from Ohio and waited. And when she heard Cole's boots on the path from the barn, she squared her shoulders and let herself know that this was real, and that she was not afraid of real. He saw her on the porch before she saw him coming. That was the thing he remembered afterward, that he'd had a few seconds of just looking at her before she noticed him on the path, and in those seconds he'd seen something in her posture that was different from the usual. She was standing very straight, which she always did, but there was a quality of decision in it, like someone who has worked something out and is ready to say it. Cole slowed his steps without meaning to. He'd been in the barn for 2 hours with Pete, dealing with a section of fence that had been half the job it turned into, as fence repairs usually were, and his hands were cold and he was tired in the straightforward way of a man who'd been using his body for 10 hours. He'd been thinking on the walk back about Harlan Briggs and the letter he'd sent and whether it would be enough, about the east pasture and whether the grass would hold another season without reseeding. The ordinary freight of a working day. And then he'd come around the corner of the barn, and there she was on his porch, and every other thought went briefly sideways. 6 weeks. He'd been trying, with partial success, to keep a clear accounting of the time, as though the counting itself was a form of sense-making, a way of saying it's been 6 weeks, and that's not long, that's not enough time to know a person. Except he'd known enough people in his life to know that the counting was not actually how it worked. Some people you knew for 20 years and they remained essentially opaque. Some people you'd known for 6 weeks, and you understood their thinking before they finished a sentence. He knew how Clara thought. He knew she would rather have an honest answer she didn't like than a comfortable answer that wasn't true. He knew she noticed things, not intrusively, but completely, the way someone notices who has made a practice of paying attention. He knew that her patience was not passive, but active, something she chose deliberately, and could stop choosing if it stopped being the right tool. He knew that she was lonely in a way she'd learned to carry quietly, the same way he was, and that the loneliness was old enough to have shaped her rather than broken her. He also knew, and this was the part he'd been working around for 2 weeks now, the way you work around a loose floorboard you haven't fixed yet, stepping over it automatically without thinking about it anymore, that he looked forward to the evenings in a way he hadn't looked forward to anything in a considerable while. He came up to the porch steps. "Pete, get the fence sorted?" she asked. "Mostly." He came up the steps. "One more section needs new post. We'll get to it tomorrow." He stopped a few feet from her and looked at her properly. "You look like you're about to say something." "I am," she said. "All right." She looked at him steadily. He'd learned that this was how she came at difficult things, head on, not circling, not softening it into something easier to receive. He respected it even when it put him on uncertain ground. "Ethan talked to me," she said. "This afternoon." Cole went still. "What did he say?" "He said that you and I are acting like this is just an arrangement," she said, "and that everyone else in this house is already acting like it's a family. And he said—" She paused, just briefly. "He said he wouldn't mind if it was. For real." Cole said nothing. The wind came across the yard and moved through the dry grass along the fence line and then went on. Clara watched him and didn't feel the silence, which was one of the things about her that had undone him, gradually, over 6 weeks. Her willingness to let a silence be a silence instead of papering over it. "He said that," Cole said. "Yes." In those words. Close enough. He looked at her for a long moment. Something he'd been holding, not consciously, not with intention, just holding the way you hold things you don't know what to do with yet, started to loosen. He felt it happen, and he couldn't have stopped it at that point even if he'd wanted to, which he found he didn't. "You've been standing out here in the cold," he said. "I have." "Because you wanted to talk to me before supper." "Yes." He exhaled, a long, slow breath that misted briefly in the cold air. "Come inside," he said. "Let me get my hands warm and we'll talk." She looked at him for just a moment, checking something, and then she nodded and went in ahead of him. He washed at the pump and stood at the kitchen stove for a minute, getting the cold out of his hands, and she made coffee without being asked. Maggie was still asleep. He could hear the quiet particular to a child's nap in that back room, and Ethan's door was closed. The house had that Sunday late afternoon feeling of things winding down toward evening. He sat at the table. She brought the coffee and sat across from him. "I said something the other night," he started. "I think about you during the day. I want you to know I meant that." "I know you meant it," she said. "I'm not good at—" He stopped. "I've had this conversation in my head probably 20 times in the last 2 weeks. It goes better in my head." "Most things do," she said. "Say it however it comes out." He put his hands around the mug. He looked at them and then at her. "I've been careful," he said. "About this. About letting it be more than what we agreed it would be. And I told myself that was reasonable. That 6 weeks wasn't long enough to know, and that the children didn't need the disruption of me." He stopped again. "But Ethan's right. I've known for a while that I wasn't being careful for good reasons. I was being careful because it was easier than the other thing." "What's the other thing?" she said, not pushing, just asking. "Saying out loud that I don't want this to be an arrangement," he said. "That I want it to be what it looks like from the outside." He met her eyes. "That I want you to be here because you want to be, not because you have nowhere else. And that I want to be the reason you want to be here." The kitchen was very quiet. Clara looked at him across the table. Her expression was not soft in the easy way. She wasn't given to easy softness. But there was something in her face that was open in a way he'd seen before, but not quite this clearly, not quite this close. "You are," she said. "Part of it. Increasingly." He breathed. "I'm not going to tell you I don't have doubts," she said. "I think doubt is honest. I don't know this land or this life well enough yet, and you don't know me well enough yet, and 6 weeks is 6 weeks." She folded her hands on the table. "But I know what I feel, and I know that I'm not a person who mistakes one thing for another, and what I feel is—" She paused, choosing the word with care. "Certain," she said. "About being here. About wanting to be here. About you." He held her gaze. "I haven't felt certain about much since Eleanor died," he said. "I felt like I was managing, keeping things going, getting through the season." He shook his head slightly. "I'd forgotten what certain felt like until you—" He stopped. "Until the ledger, until the curtain rod, until you sat across this table and told me what you actually thought, instead of what I wanted to hear." "I wasn't going to tell you what you wanted to hear," she said. "I know. That was—" He almost said terrifying and landed instead on "new." The corner of her mouth moved. "I'll take that." He looked at her for a moment longer. "So what do we do?" he said. "Practically, what does it look like?" "I think," she said slowly, "it looks like we stop being careful with each other. Stop treating this as provisional." She straightened slightly. "And I think we tell the children, properly. Not a speech, just honestly. That we've decided this is real, that we chose it." "Ethan already seems to know," he said. "He knows what he sees. He should hear it said." She paused. Maggie, especially. He thought about Maggie on the first day, standing in the yard in her unraveling pigtails. "Can you be my mama?" He thought about the green coat. He thought about what Ethan had said. "He watches you the way he used to watch my mother," and felt the complicated weight of that, the grief and the truth of it both. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. They sat with that for a moment. It wasn't resolved. Nothing about the next weeks and months would be simple, and they both knew it. But it was said, and said plainly, and between two people who had agreed not to tell each other things they didn't mean, the saying of it carried weight. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not with any drama, just placed it there, his calloused hand over her smaller one, and left it. She turned her hand over under his and held it. They sat like that until Maggie's door opened and the sound of small feet on the floor came down the hall, and by then they were ready. So, they told the children before supper. It wasn't planned as a formal thing, and it didn't feel like one. Maggie came out rumpled from sleep, hair loose and coat still on for some reason known only to herself, and Ethan came out of his room a few minutes later as if he'd heard something, which he probably had, through the thin wall, just the quality of the silence. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at both of them at the table, their hands no longer touching but something else present in the room, some shift in the air. "Sit down for a minute," Cole said. "Both of you." Maggie climbed into her chair immediately. Ethan moved more slowly, the watchfulness back in his face, but he sat. Cole looked at Clara, and she gave him a small nod, and he looked at his children. "I want to tell you something," he said, "about Clara and about how things are." He wasn't entirely sure how to start it, which was the truth of him, and he didn't dress it up. When Clara came, we had an agreement, a practical arrangement. She would come and be part of the household, and we would see how it suited. He paused. It has suited. Better than I expected, and I expected a lot. He looked at Maggie, then at Ethan. "What I want to tell you is that it's not an arrangement anymore. Clara is—" He stopped and looked at Clara, because she said what she meant better than he did. "I'm staying," Clara said, "not because of the agreement, because I want to be here, because this is where I want to be." She looked at Maggie. "Because you asked me the first day if I could be your mama. And I said I didn't know yet. I know now." Maggie had gone very still. "And yes," Maggie said, "very small." "And yes," Clara said. Maggie was across the kitchen and in her arms in about half a second, which involved knocking her chair sideways and not caring about it at all. Clara caught her and held her, and Maggie pressed her face against Clara's shoulder and made a sound that was not quite crying but was in that neighborhood. Cole looked at Ethan. Ethan was looking at the table. His jaw was tight in the way it got when he was working at something. Holding it in or letting it out, Cole could never quite tell. Then he looked up. "So it's real," Ethan said. To Clara, not to him. "It's real," she said, over Maggie's head. Ethan nodded slowly. He looked at Cole. "You're not going to change your mind." "No," Cole said. His son looked at him for a long moment with those eyes that had been watchful since he was 9 years old, that had learned to look for the places where things might break before they broke, and Cole held the look and didn't look away. Then Ethan did something Cole hadn't seen him do in a long time. He let his shoulders down. Not dramatically. You might have missed it if you weren't watching. Just a fraction. Just enough to mean something. "Okay," Ethan said. It was not a grand reconciliation. It was not tears or speeches or anything that would have looked significant from the outside. It was a 12-year-old boy saying okay and meaning it, which was everything, actually, which was more than Cole had let himself hope for, some days. He reached across the table and put his hand briefly on his son's shoulder. Ethan didn't pull away. They stayed like that for a moment, all four of them in the kitchen in the gray Sunday light. Maggie still holding on to Clara, Ethan sitting with his shoulders down, Cole with his hand on his son's shoulder, all of them a little uncertain of what came next except that they were going to do it together. "I'm hungry," Maggie said into Clara's shoulder. Clara laughed, a real one, the kind that had started showing up more often over the past few weeks. "Then we should make supper," she said. Maggie pulled back far enough to look at her face. She studied it with the thoroughness she brought to all evaluations. Then she nodded, apparently satisfied with what she found, and got down and righted her chair and climbed back into it. Cole caught Clara's eye over Maggie's head. She looked at him, that clear, direct look of hers, and he thought, yes. Whatever came next, whatever it cost, whatever the Daggerts did or the weather did, or the next 10 seasons of hard work on demanding land, yes. He got up to start supper, because supper still needed to happen. The next 2 weeks were different. He couldn't have said precisely how, except that the carefulness was gone. Not care itself, they were both careful people by nature, but the managed distance, the deliberate maintenance of space between them, the way they'd both been treating the house like a room with furniture arranged specifically so you don't bump into things. They bumped into things now. Not literally, or occasionally literally, in the way of two people sharing a kitchen, but there was a new ease to the household that seemed to reach into every part of it. He caught himself telling her things he hadn't told anyone in a long time. Not dramatic things, just the daily things. What Frank Deezer had said about the weather moving in, what the feed merchant in town had told him about the price of hay next season, and what that might mean for the cattle. Small, ordinary things that had been accumulating somewhere in him with nowhere to go, and now they had somewhere. She talked more too. He noticed that. Not that she'd been silent before, she'd never been silent, but there was something less measured about it now, something that was less edited. She told him about her father, who had been a difficult man in ways she was still working out the shape of, and about a student she'd had in her third year of teaching who had not been able to read at 8 years old, and everyone had given up on him, and she had not, and what it had felt like when he'd finally read a sentence out loud in class, halting and then not halting. She told him about George, more than she had before, specific things, the texture of the years rather than just the shape of the loss. He listened. He was learning, better at listening than at talking, which she accommodated without needing to say so. One evening, about 10 days after the conversation on the porch, he came in from checking the stock and found her at the table with her accounts and her pencil, and also with Maggie asleep against her side, head on Clara's arm, mouth slightly open. Clara was working around her, the pencil moving carefully so as not to wake her, her left arm staying still under Maggie's head. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She looked up. She was supposed to be in bed an hour ago, Clara said quietly, but she wanted to stay up, and I didn't have the heart. She does that, he said. I know. I'm learning. He crossed the room, gathered Maggie up. She stirred but didn't wake, just made a small sound and went limp again in the way of deeply sleeping children, and carried her to bed. By the time he'd covered her and come back, Clara had put the accounts away and was at the stove with the kettle. Coffee, she said. Please. He sat. She brought the coffee and sat across from him, and for a while they just sat in the quiet the way they did. And then she said, I got a letter today. Something in her tone made him look up. From who? A woman I taught with in Ohio. She turned the mug in her hands. She heard I'd gone out west, she said, which is how she phrased it. She wanted to know if I was all right. She paused. She made it sound like she expected me not to be. Are you? He said, and meant it as a real question. She looked at him. More than I've been in a long time, she said. Which is... She shook her head slightly. I didn't expect that. I expected to be all right. I expected it to be manageable. I didn't expect to be... She stopped. More, he said. Yes. He held her gaze. I'm going to write a letter to the minister in Mercer Flats, he said, about a date. She went still. For the wedding. For the wedding, he said. If that's... He stopped. I should have asked properly. I haven't asked properly. You're asking now, she said. He looked at her across the coffee and the lamp and 6 weeks and 10 days of ordinary life that had built into something neither of them had planned for and both of them were now certain about. He was not, as he'd established, a man of great eloquence. He didn't reach for it now. Will you marry me? He said. Not because of the arrangement, because I want to. Because this is right. She looked at him for a moment. Her eyes were clear and direct, and he could see, not softness, she was not a soft woman, but something that was warm in its own way, something that was hers specifically and was aimed at him. Yes, she said. That's yes, he breathed. Something settled in him that had been unsettled for a long time. Not years of grief exactly, but years of managing without being settled. And the settling felt like putting something heavy down that you'd carried long enough to stop noticing the weight. She reached across the table and touched his hand, briefly, and then sat back and picked up her coffee. When? She said. Before winter sets in harder, he said. 4 weeks, maybe. I'll write tomorrow. She nodded. She was practical even now, which he loved about her. The way she received a thing and immediately thought about the next step. Didn't linger in sentimentality longer than it warranted. We should tell the children in the morning, she said. They already know, he said. Ethan does. Maggie should be told properly, with the word wedding, or she'll feel left out. He almost smiled. That's right. Also Ruth Sable, she said. She'll want to know. Why? Because she's been watching out for this family, and she deserves to hear it from us. She paused. and because she'll know whether there's anyone who can make the cake. He did smile then. He couldn't help it. You're already thinking about the cake. Someone has to, she said, entirely serious. Maggie will want to be involved. She'll want pink. The wedding cake? She'll argue for it. He shook his head, but the smile stayed. He thought about his daughter arguing for a pink wedding cake with the conviction of someone who has never once lost an argument she felt strongly about. And he thought about Clara managing the negotiation with the particular combination of patience and firmness that was her specific skill. And he thought, this is my life now. This kitchen, these people, this woman across the table. He was grateful in a way that didn't need a word. He wrote to the minister the next morning. Clara wrote to Ruth Sable. Maggie was told at breakfast and responded by immediately requesting to know if she could be a flower girl, which apparently required flowers, and would the flowers be available in November, because flowers in November seemed uncertain to her. We'll find something, Clara told her. What if there's nothing? There's always dried flowers. They're nice. Maggie considered this with the expression of someone who has reservations but is willing to be convinced. Could they be yellow? They could be yellow. And I need a new dress. You need a new dress, Clara agreed. Ethan, across the table, ate his breakfast with a private expression that was, Cole noticed, not quite a smile, but was in that general territory. He didn't say anything about the wedding, not directly. But after breakfast, when everyone else had gone to their respective parts of the morning, he stopped in the kitchen doorway on his way out and said to Clara, I'm glad it's you. Clara looked at him. Not someone else, Ethan said. I'm glad it was you who came. Then he went out, and the door closed, and Clara stood in the kitchen alone for a moment with her hand at her mouth, and Cole, who had been coming in from the porch and had heard it through the window, stood outside in the cold morning for a moment and let his son's words land. I'm glad it was you who came. He thought about the letter he'd received from 30-some applicants, and the 30 that had been perfectly fine, and the one that had said plainly, I am not beautiful, and I have no family money, and I'm not given to complaint. He thought about a woman stepping off a stagecoach after 11 days of travel, covered in dust, with a torn dress pinned at the hem, looking like someone who had come too far to turn around. He'd known, he thought. Not consciously, not in a way he would have admitted then, but somewhere underneath the practical assessment, underneath the relief of someone capable and honest finally arriving, he'd known. He went inside. The minister wrote back within the week. A Saturday, 3 weeks hence, at the small church in Mercer Flats. Simple, he said. Witnesses required. Would there be family in attendance? No family from my side, Clara said when Cole showed her the letter. Not that could make it in 3 weeks. I have a brother in Colorado, he said. He probably won't make it either. He looked at the letter. Is that all right? Just us and the children, and whoever from town shows up. That's more than enough, she said. Ruth Sable, when she received Clara's letter, appeared at the ranch 2 days later in her wagon with a bolt of fabric she said was good for a dress, a jar of pickled peaches that were irrelevant to weddings, but she'd had extra, and opinions on the cake situation. She and Clara sat at the kitchen table for an hour, and Clara did the thing she'd always done with decisive personalities, which was let them make the arguments and then quietly steered toward the actual decision she'd already made. Ruth left satisfied with a plan that was substantially the plan Clara had started with. She's something, Ruth told Cole on her way out, nodding back toward the house. I know, he said. You do know. Ruth looked at him with the directness of someone who'd known him for years. You look different, Cole. Good different. Like a man who's stopped holding his breath. He didn't have an answer for that, but he thought about it for the rest of the day. The 3 weeks moved faster than he expected, which was probably because the ranch didn't stop for weddings. There was the fence still to finish and the hay to check and the Daggert situation, which had quieted slightly since Harlan Briggs had written back from Montana with a letter that was, as Clara had said when she read it, worth considerably more than a quiet. The letter documented the original boundary clearly and with the specificity of someone who had been there when it was set. Cole's lawyer in Cheyenne had already sent copies to the relevant offices. The Daggerts had not moved any more fence stakes since. It's not over, Cole told her one evening. I know, she said, but it's turned. Maybe. It's turned, she said, with the certainty she brought to things she'd thought through completely. They were counting on you being stretched too thin to push back properly. You pushed back. They'll wait and see what ground they have left. He thought she was right. He usually thought she was right, which was sometimes inconvenient, but mostly useful. The night before the wedding, he couldn't sleep, which he hadn't expected. He lay in the dark for an hour, and then got up and went to the kitchen and sat at the table in the dark without bothering with the lamp. He wasn't anxious, exactly. He was alert, the way you are before something that matters. He heard her door open, which surprised him. Her footsteps in the hall, and then she was in the kitchen doorway, wrapped in the old quilt she'd commandeered from the storage chest. "You're up," she said, not whispering. "Can't sleep," he said. "Me either." She came in and sat down at the table. In the dark, he could see her in outline, the quilt around her shoulders, her hair down, which he'd rarely seen. She looked like herself and also different, in the way people look in the dark when the managed version is off. "Cold feet?" she said. "No," he said. "You?" "No." She was quiet. "I keep thinking about George," she said, "which I didn't expect, not missing him exactly, though I do miss him. Just thinking about him." She paused. "I think he would have liked you." "Yeah." "He had no patience for men who said things they didn't mean," she said. "And he was good to people who worked hard without making it a show." She tilted her head. "He would have respected you." Cole sat with that. "Eleanor," he started. "She would have laughed at me for being this slow about it." He shook his head. "She always said I needed things put in front of me plainly before I could see them. She wasn't wrong." "I put it in front of you fairly plainly," Claire said. "You did," he said. "It still took me a while." "That's all right." Her voice was easy. "We got there." They sat in the dark for a while. The kitchen was cold enough that their breath misted faintly. Outside, Wyoming was doing its thing, but wind low and steady, the wide silence underneath. "Are you scared?" he asked. Not of the wedding. He meant something larger. She thought about it honestly. "Of the work? No," she said. "Of the land? No. Of you." She paused. "Of what happens when people who are trying to be honest with each other have to work through something hard. A little. Not because I don't trust you, because working through hard things is hard." "Yeah," he said. "But I'd rather that than the alternative," she said, "which is not trying." He looked at her across the dark kitchen. "I'm not going to be easy all the time," he said. "I go quiet when I should talk. I hold on to things too long before I know," she said. "And I'll tell you when you need to stop doing that, and you'll tell me when I'm being too direct for the situation. That's the deal." "Is it that simple?" "It's exactly that complicated," she said. "But yes." He let out a long, slow breath. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. She got up, quilt trailing. She paused at the kitchen doorway. "Cole." He looked at her. "I'm glad you wrote me back," she said. He thought about the letter, the 4 careful sentences he'd written in response to the most honest letter he'd received, from a woman he'd never met, who had nothing to offer except herself and thought that was worth saying plainly. "I'm glad you wrote," he said. She nodded once and went back down the hall, and he sat in the dark for another little while and then went back to bed. And this time he slept. The wedding was small. The minister's church held perhaps 40 people on a generous count, and they filled about half the pews with the people who'd come from the ranches nearby. People who knew Cole and had been watching the Mercer situation with a mixture of concern and hope and the particular interest that communities take in one another's survival. Ruth Sable and her husband sat in the front row on the left. Frank Deezer and Pete Holt, slightly uncomfortable in their good shirts, sat in the middle. Ethan stood up with his father. He was still quiet, still watchful, but the quality of it had shifted. He was watchful in the way of someone paying attention to something good rather than bracing for something bad. And he stood straight and held still through the whole of it. Maggie had yellow dried flowers. She had gotten the yellow, but not the pink dress. She was wearing the green coat over her good Sunday dress, which she'd decided was better anyway, and she walked down the aisle ahead of Clara with enormous seriousness, distributing flowers in a pattern that made sense only to herself. Clara wore the best dress she'd brought from Ohio. Dark blue wool, nothing fancy, but it fit her well and she'd pressed it the night before until there was not a wrinkle in it. She carried a small bunch of the dried yellow flowers she'd set aside from Maggie's supply. She walked without anyone giving her away, which was accurate. She was not being given to anyone, she was choosing, and she walked like it. Cole watched her come down the aisle and thought about the first sight of her stepping off the stagecoach, dusty and tired and pinned at the hem, and how he'd known, somewhere under the practical assessment, and how it had taken 6 weeks in a conversation with his 12-year-old son to say it out loud. He thought he should have been embarrassed about the time it had taken. He found he mostly wasn't, because they'd gotten here, and they were here, and she was walking toward him with that clear, direct look of hers already on his face. And that was enough. The minister said the words. They said the words back. The vows were the standard ones. She'd said she didn't need anything particular, and he'd agreed because what they'd said to each other at the kitchen table in the dark was more specific anyway and didn't need to be repeated in public. When it was done, Maggie threw the rest of the yellow flowers in the air, which was not traditional but was Maggie, and Ruth Sable laughed from the front row, and Ethan, this was the thing Cole held afterward, the moment he kept, Ethan, standing beside him, put his hand in his father's hand, briefly, and squeezed it once. Cole squeezed back. Outside, the November sky was high and pale, and the cold was the kind that meant what it said, and the small crowd of people who had come to watch came out after them and said the things people say, and meant most of them. Ruth Sable told Clara she'd done well, which Clara received with the look of someone who appreciated the directness. Clara took Cole's arm as they walked to the wagon. Maggie ran ahead. Ethan walked beside them, not apart. The ranch was 40 minutes away. It would be there when they got back, as it had been every day. The work, and the land, and the 40 head of cattle, and the fence that needed finishing, and the Daggert situation, and the winter coming. All of it exactly as demanding and complicated as it had been yesterday. Nothing about the ordinary weight of it had changed, but they were going home to it together, and that changed everything that mattered. The first winter was the hardest, which Clara had expected. What she hadn't expected was the specific texture of its difficulty, not the cold, which was brutal but manageable, and not the isolation, which was real but not unbearable, but the way the winter compressed everything into close quarters and left no room for any of them to be anything other than exactly who they were. In the warmer months, there was always something to escape to. The garden, the barn, the long open distances of the ranch that gave a person breathing room when the interior of the house got too close. Winter took that away. They were in the house together, all 4 of them, more hours of the day than any of them were fully accustomed to, and they scraped against each other the way people do when there's no space to not. Maggie was the easiest, in the way that 5-year-olds are easy. Her moods arrived fast and departed fast, and she didn't carry grievances overnight. She got bored and difficult when she'd been inside too long, which was most of December and all of January, and Clara handled the boredom with the toolkit of a 9-year teacher. Reading, arithmetic turned into games, small projects with her hands. She taught Maggie to sew a straight seam. Maggie produced a square of fabric with a seam that was straight by the most generous possible definition, and she was so proud of it that she showed it to Cole 3 times and put it on the windowsill where she could see it from her chair. Ethan was harder, but not in the ways Clara had worried about before the wedding. He had accepted her, was accepting her, in the ongoing way of things that are processes rather than events, and the closed-door watchfulness had given way to something more like a genuine, careful regard. What was hard was that he was 12 and going on 13, and he had thoughts that were too big for the house some days and nowhere to put them. She found him one afternoon in February sitting in the barn in the cold rather than the house, which told her everything she needed to know about the state of his interior life. "Your father's looking for you," she said from the barn door. "I know," he said. He was sitting on a hay bale, not doing anything, just sitting. "I'll be in." She came in and leaned against the post near the door. The barn was cold but out of the wind, which was something. The horse with the once bruised foreleg was in the nearest stall, and looked at her over the gate with the mild interest of a horse that has decided it approves of a person. "Things feeling small today?" she said. Ethan looked at her. "What does that mean?" "Like the house is too close, like everything is right on top of you." He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "something like that." It passes, she said. Winter does. I know winter passes. He picked at a piece of straw. It's not about winter. She waited. I want to go somewhere, he said. Not away. I don't mean I don't want to leave. I just want to go somewhere and come back. See something different for a while. He shook his head at himself. It sounds stupid. It doesn't sound stupid, she said. It sounds like a 13-year-old. He looked at her sideways. Almost 13. March, she said, because she'd learned his birthday the way she'd learned everything else about this family, incrementally, by paying attention. There's a man in Cheyenne, she said. He runs cattle drives in summer. I've heard your father mention him. When you're older and you want to go, that's a real thing. How much older? 15, 16 maybe? Old enough to be useful. She looked at him. That's not so far. He thought about that. Some of the coiled tension in him went down slightly. You really think he'd let me? I think your father would miss you badly and agree because he'd understand, she said. Those two things can both be true. Ethan was quiet again. Then, did you ever want to go somewhere before you came here? She considered the question honestly. I did go somewhere, she said. I went 11 days on a stagecoach across most of the country. She paused. That was my going somewhere. It turned out to be the right one. He looked at her with a complicated expression, young and old at the same time, the way adolescent faces are, and nodded slowly as if filing it for later. Come in when you're ready, she said. Your father found a chess problem in a magazine that he cannot solve, and I've been pretending I can't either, so he doesn't feel bad, but I'm running out of patience for pretending. Ethan almost smiled. He hates losing at chess. He does, she agreed. Come show him up. She went back to the house, and 15 minutes later she heard his boots on the porch. She and Cole scraped against each other twice that winter, which she thought was honest and reasonable and not a sign of anything broken. The first time was in January, over the Daggert situation, which had heated back up when Hal Daggert sent a letter to Cole through an attorney claiming that Harlan Briggs's testimony was inadmissible because Briggs had not been present at the original survey. The letter was written in the kind of legal language designed to sound more authoritative than it was, and Clara said so, and Cole said she didn't know enough about territorial law to say that, and Clara said she knew enough to recognize a bluff in formal dress, and Cole went outside and didn't come in for 2 hours. When he came back in, she was at the table with the letter and a notepad. Your lawyer needs to respond by month's end, she said. The claim about Briggs is wrong. The survey description itself is the primary evidence. Briggs is corroborating evidence. The claim doesn't hold. Cole stood in the doorway. He had that look of a man who has been outside long enough to get the anger down to something manageable. I know, he said. Then write to your lawyer tomorrow. I was going to. I know you were. She looked at him steadily. I wasn't doubting you. I was thinking out loud. He exhaled, came in, hung up his coat. I know, he said. I'm sorry. I wasn't exactly quiet about my opinions, she said. No, he said. The corner of his mouth moved. You weren't. We both need to be louder than we're comfortable with sometimes, she said. The deal was we'd tell each other when it was necessary. The deal, he said. The deal, she confirmed. He sat down. Write it out, he said. What you think the response should say. I'll look at it tonight and send it to the lawyer. She wrote it out. He read it, changed 2 words, and sent it. His lawyer wrote back 2 weeks later saying it was exactly the right argument, and he would have said much the same himself. Cole did not tell Clara that her framing had been right, but he made her coffee without being asked for a week straight, which was its own language. The second collision was quieter and harder. It was a night in February, the coldest stretch, the kind of cold that had a sound to it, a low pressure in the air. She'd been going through some things in the storage chest and had found the photograph she'd found once before in the barn. It must have made its way inside at some point, or it had always been there and she'd missed it. She held it for a moment, looking at Eleanor Mercer's vivid, animated face, and put it on the table. She wasn't sure why she left it on the table instead of putting it away. Maybe she was tired of things being managed rather than addressed. Cole came in and saw it. He went very still. Not angry. She could tell the difference now. Something older than anger. Where did you find that? He said. In the storage chest. She looked at him. I think it should be somewhere the children can see it. His jaw tightened. Clara, she's their mother, she said. She should be in the house, not managed away in a storage chest or tucked behind a barn shelf. She kept her voice even. That's not a threat to me. I'm not threatened by a photograph. He looked at the photograph on the table and nodded at her. I know you're not, he said. Then why does it feel like she's supposed to be invisible? He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer, which would have been its own kind of answer. Then he sat down heavily and put his hands flat on the table the way he always did when he was working at something difficult. It's not about you, he said. He stopped. When I see it, I think about everything I should have done differently, things I said, things I didn't say. The last year she was sick and how I kept thinking we had more time. He shook his head. It's easier not to see it. I know, she said. But easier isn't always the right measure. He looked at her then. Ethan needs to know it's allowed to remember her, she said. Maggie needs a face to put with the word mother, because she barely has one. If we put the photograph away, we're telling them something about grief that isn't true, that you're supposed to manage it out of sight. He was quiet. She made you, she said. She made this family. She's part of why you're the person I married. She held his gaze. I'm not asking you to stop missing her. I'm asking you to let the children see that it's all right to. Cole looked at the photograph for a long moment. His face was doing several things at once that she didn't try to name. Where would you put it? He said, finally. The main room, she said, on the shelf by the window, where the light's good. He was quiet for another moment. Then he picked up the photograph, stood up, and went to the main room. She heard him set something down on the shelf. He came back and sat down and said nothing for a while, and she gave him the silence because it was what he needed. Thank you, he said, eventually. It came out roughly. You don't have to thank me, she said. I want to. He looked at her. She would have liked you, he said. She had no patience for people who weren't honest, and she thought most people weren't honest enough. He shook his head. She would have argued with you about everything and meant it as a compliment. Clara felt something in her chest, not grief for a woman she'd never known, but something adjacent to it, some recognition of what this man had lost and what it had cost him to still be standing here, still trying. I'll take that, she said. Spring came the way it always comes in Wyoming, sudden and violent, and not particularly sorry about the winter it was ending. The snow went in patches. The creek north of the ranch ran high and loud for 2 weeks. The mud was consequential. Clara replanted the kitchen garden with the knowledge of what had worked the previous fall and what hadn't. And she moved the squash to the far end this time, away from the fence, where Eleanor had always planted it. She didn't make a thing of that. She just put it where it would do better. The Daggert situation resolved in April, which was not a dramatic resolution, but a real one. The Territorial Land Office sent an official determination. The original survey description governed the boundary, and the fence stakes were to be returned to their correct position within 30 days. Hal Daggert had one more letter sent through his attorney, suggesting that there were other interpretations available and that he was prepared to pursue them. Cole wrote back through his own lawyer, briefly, saying that he was welcome to and that Cole had the original survey documents, the corroborating witness letter, and the territorial determination, and looked forward to any further conversation that Daggert wished to initiate. There was no further conversation. Cole came home from the lawyer's office in Cheyenne and sat down at the kitchen table and told her, and she sat across from him and they looked at each other for a moment, and then she said, "Good." "It took 2 years," he said. "It should have been 6 months." "But it ended," she said. "That's not nothing." He almost smiled. "You always say that." "Because it's always true." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. She turned hers over and held it, the way they'd learned to, brief and certain, the language of people who have found a reliable shorthand for the things that matter most. Ethan turned 13 in March and did not go anywhere that summer, but he did spend 2 weeks working with a neighboring rancher named Jim Aldridge, no relation to the Mrs. Aldridge who'd left, who ran cattle further north and needed an extra hand for the seasonal push. Cole had arranged it quietly, and Clara had known about the arranging, and neither of them had mentioned the conversation in the barn until Ethan came home from those 2 weeks dusty and tired and carrying himself differently. Not older exactly, but like someone who'd tested a version of himself and found it held up. He ate 2 full plates of supper that first night back and didn't say much, and after dinner he helped clear the dishes without being asked. He'd always done his chores, but this was different. This was voluntary and easy. And then he sat in the main room and told them, in his careful way, about the work. The cattle. The other men on the crew, one of whom had told Ethan he had a natural hand with the horses. The country north of the ranch, which was different from this land in ways that Ethan tried to describe, and then gave up on describing, because some things, he said, you had to see. Cole listened to all of this with the particular attention of a father who is watching his son become himself, which is one of the better things a person can watch, and one of the harder ones to sit with. Later, after the children were in bed, he said to Clara, "That was your idea. You arranged it," she said. "You told him it was a real thing," he said, "in the barn, in February, that it was possible." He looked at her. "He came to me 2 weeks later and asked if there was someone he could work with this summer. He'd already figured out what he wanted. He just needed to know it was allowed." She thought about Ethan in the barn, coiled and winter compressed and too young for what he was feeling and too old for it not to matter. "He's going to be all right," she said, not as a wish, as a conclusion she'd arrived at from evidence. "Yeah," Cole said. "He is." That. The summer Maggie turned 7, she taught herself to read with minimal instruction, which was less a credit to Clara's teaching than to Maggie's absolute refusal to be the only person in the house who couldn't. She read everything available to her and then demanded more, and Clara wrote to a bookseller in Cheyenne and ordered 3 books, and Maggie worked through them in 2 months and looked up from the last page of the last one with the expression of someone who has discovered a room with no ceiling. "There are more," Clara told her. "How many more?" "More than you'll read in a lifetime, probably." Maggie considered this with the seriousness she brought to large ideas. "Then I should start," she said. Clara ordered 6 more books. She thought sometimes about the schoolroom in Harlan County, Ohio, the cold winters and the hot summers, and the 30 children who had been hers for 9 years in the way that students are a teacher's, which is particular and not nothing. She had been good at that work. She did not miss it exactly, but she thought about it the way you think about a place you've left that was genuinely good, with gratitude, not grief. This was different. The scale was smaller, which made everything larger. When Ethan sat with a problem until he solved it, not because she told him to, but because he was the kind of person who had decided not to walk away from things he could understand if he tried, she felt it in a way that 30 students hadn't quite prepared her for. When Maggie read herself to sleep and had to be gently relieved of the book before the lamp burned all night, it was specific and hers in a way that the classroom had never been. She thought about the woman she'd been in Ohio, practical and honest and capable and quietly, persistently lonely in a way she hadn't fully admitted until it was over. She didn't regret that woman. That woman had written a letter. The letter. She thought about it sometimes, still. She'd written 4 drafts. The one she'd sent was the most honest. She'd been afraid of that at the time, afraid that honesty without ornament was unattractive, that a man looking for a wife wanted something presented better than the plain truth of her. And then Cole Mercer had written back and said her letter was the most straightforward he'd received, and she'd understood something that took her longer to articulate, that the right person doesn't need you to be more than you are. They need you to be exactly what you are, clearly enough that they can recognize it. She thought about that a lot in the years that followed, about what it means to let yourself be known versus what it means to manage what's known about you. She'd spent most of her adult life being capable and dependable and not particularly visible, good at the job, good at the task, present and useful, and not asking for much. There is a safety in that. There is also a particular kind of loneliness that comes from making yourself easy to miss. She had stopped being easy to miss. Not because she'd changed what she was still practical, still direct, still more comfortable with honesty than with comfort, but because she'd stopped treating those things as apologies. She was what she was, and she was here, and the people who needed to know her knew her. That was not a small thing. For a long time, she hadn't known it was possible. The Daggerts sold their ranch the following spring to a family from Nebraska who turned out to be decent neighbors and fixed the boundary fence properly and without complaint. Cole told Clara about it one evening at the kitchen table. The same lamp, though the lamp was new because the old one had finally given up the previous winter. And she received the news with the equanimity she brought to things that had resolved correctly. "Done," she said. "Done," he agreed. They sat with that for a moment. Outside, the Wyoming spring was doing its aggressive best. The sky enormous and pale blue, the grass coming up where the snow had finally retreated, the creek running high. "I have something to tell you," she said. He looked at her. She was 40 years old. She had thought, after George, that some particular futures were simply not available anymore, had made a kind of peace with it, the way you make peace with doors that have closed. She had not thought to look too closely at whether the doors were actually closed or whether she'd simply stopped trying them. "We're going to need the back room," she said. "The storage room. Eventually." He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched him understand. His face did something she hadn't seen before. Something that was too large for his usual expressions, that broke through the careful management and the contained quality entirely, and was just open, stunned and open, and something that was not quite any one word. "Clara," he said. "March," she said. "Probably. It's early yet." He stood up from the table so fast the chair scraped back, and he came around to her side and she stood up too, and he held her the way you hold something you hadn't let yourself hope for, carefully, completely, with his hands in her hair and his face against her temple, and neither of them saying anything for a long time because there was nothing that needed saying. She felt his heart against her chest, fast and certain. They stood in the kitchen like that until Maggie's voice came from the hall, asking what they were doing, and Cole laughed. A real one, the full one, the one she'd been working toward for over a year, and said they were just talking, and Maggie said that didn't look like talking from where she was standing, and Clara laughed too, and the kitchen was full of it for a moment, the sound of a house where people are glad to be. They told the children the next day. Maggie received the news with the intensity she brought to all significant developments. There was a period of approximately 4 minutes during which she asked 16 questions, most of which began with, "But what if or can I?" And then she arrived at the fundamental satisfaction she'd been working toward. She would have a sibling, and she had opinions about what kind. "A sister," she said. "I want a sister." "We don't get to pick," Cole said. Maggie looked at him with the expression of someone who finds this information inconvenient. "We should be able to." "We can't." "Then I'll take a brother," she said, in the tone of a person making a significant concession. "But he has to be nice." "Babies aren't nice or not nice," Ethan said from across the table. "They're just babies." Maggie looked at him. "How do you know?" "Because that's what babies are." "You don't know that." "I do know that." Clara looked at Cole over the children's heads. He looked back at her. Something passed between them that was wordless and complete. The particular communication of two people who have built a shared language out of ordinary time. Something like, "This is our life. All of it. This exact table, these exact people arguing about what babies are like." Something like, "Yes." Ethan, when the argument with Maggie wound down, looked at Clara with the expression she'd come to know as his thinking face, the one that meant he was saying something he'd considered properly. "Are you scared?" he asked. He meant it seriously. "A little," she said. "Honestly, I haven't done this before." "You figured everything else out," he said. She looked at this boy who had stood in a kitchen with his hand on her shoulder in November of last year and said, "I'm glad it was you who came," who had let her in, slowly and with good reason, and then let her all the way in, who was going to be a remarkable man. "I had good material to work with," she said. He looked mildly uncomfortable with the compliment, which was characteristic, and looked down at his breakfast, which was also characteristic. But she saw the corner of his mouth just for a second. The baby was a boy, born in late February in the room that had been cleared and prepared with the particular thoroughness of a household that had learned to prepare for things in advance. He was small and loud, and had a look on his face in his first hours that Clara privately thought resembled her own father, which was an alarming thought she kept to herself. They named him James. Cole had suggested it. It had been his father's name, and Clara had said yes immediately, because it suited. Maggie, upon being introduced, studied James for about 30 seconds with enormous seriousness, and then announced that he was smaller than she'd expected, but she would keep him. Ethan held him with the careful competence of someone who has decided to do something correctly, or not at all, and looked down at his brother's face and said nothing for a while, and then said, quietly, that he had his mother's forehead. Clara looked at him. "Your forehead," Ethan said, not looking up from the baby. "Not—" He stopped. "I meant you, his mother." She felt the word land. His mother. Not as a replacement, not as a correction to anything, just as a fact about who she was to this child, and by extension, who she had become in this house. She didn't say anything, because there was nothing that needed saying that wouldn't make it smaller. Cole was sitting next to her on the edge of the bed. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him slightly. Just slightly. She'd never been a person who leaned. And they watched Ethan hold James while Maggie stood on her tiptoes to see better, and delivered her ongoing assessment of the baby's various features. The ranch outside was quiet in the way of a February morning, cold and gray and very still, the land resting under the tail end of winter. In a few months the grass would come up and the work would begin again in earnest, the cattle and the fences and the garden and the 100 small necessary things that made up a working life in this place. There would be hard years ahead. There were always hard years. That was not pessimism, but experience. And she'd had enough of both to know the difference. There would be arguments and difficulties and seasons when everything cost more than expected and yielded less. There would also be this, the kitchen table in the evenings, the lamp, the sound of children in a house that had once been defined by their absence from it, a man who said what he meant and meant what he said and had learned, imperfectly and over time, to say it before he'd made it perfect. A family that had not arrived already, made but had been built, ordinary day by ordinary day, out of letters and dust and practical decisions that turned out to be something more. She thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in Wyoming on a September afternoon, covering her ground with her dress torn and her bag in her hand and nothing much to offer except herself stated plainly. That woman had believed somewhere underneath the practicality that maybe the right place didn't have to be found by accident, that maybe you could choose it, with your eyes open and your expectations honest, and if you chose it for the right reasons and you worked at it with everything you had, it would become what you were choosing it to be. She had been right, not because it had been easy, because it hadn't. Not because everything had worked out tidily, because very little had been tidy, but because the thing she'd been afraid to admit she wanted, a place to belong to that was genuinely hers, people who knew her and stayed anyway, had turned out to be available, not given, not stumbled into, built, in the way of all things worth having, with intention and imperfect hands and enough ordinary days stacked on top of each other that one day you look up and realize you are not where you started. You are home. In the storage chest at the back of the house, folded in brown paper, was the dress she'd worn off the stagecoach, torn at the hem and never properly repaired. She'd thought about throwing it out once and had not, though she couldn't have said then exactly why. She could say now, not because it was pretty or useful or worth the space it took, but because some things you keep to remind yourself of what you came from. How far you were willing to travel without knowing what was at the end of it. How much you were willing to trust that honesty stated plainly might be enough. How it felt to step off a coach into a stranger's life, with everything uncertain and find, eventually, that the uncertainty had been the beginning of something, not the absence of it. She kept the dress because it was the day she had arrived believing she was probably too much work for anyone to want, and discovered she had been exactly wrong. Outside, February held the land in its specific quiet. James made a small sound, the way new things do, announcing themselves, testing the air. Maggie said something to Ethan that made him make that almost smile. Cole's arm was steady around her shoulders. Clara looked at all of it, the room, the people, the morning coming gray through the window, and thought, yes, this is what it looks like when you choose something and it chooses you back. That was enough. That was in fact everything.